Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let me have some brief housekeeping announcement that please refrain from moving around during the symposium. And if you do have any questions, please type them in the chatting window and we will entertain your questions. We do have several presentations which will be delivered in English, so simultaneous interpretation will be available. So please select the channel that you want. And also please put your cell phones either on vibrate mode or mute mode. And we are going to begin the symposium 5 o'clock to the dot. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to International Symposium 2022, which is now being held under the title of Rethink, Imagine and Act. I am the moderator of today's symposium. My name is Chu Il. Very nice to see you. Art Council Korea has been holding this international symposium since 2016 in order to promote international exchanges of the Korean art. And for the past 2 years, the world suffered from the pandemic crisis, which particularly affected the mobility, the very basic requirement of the human life. And this universal common experience has given us an opportunity to look back on the history of the world and humanity and pose questions on sustainability. The 2022 ARKO International Symposium aims to shed a new light on the world that we all are living and present the world that we will create with artistic imagination and propose action with arts. So for the 2 days, we are going to have this ARKO International Symposium. And without further ado, let us begin. We'll first begin the symposium with the opening remarks by the chairperson Park Jong-kwon of the Arts Council Korea.
Distinguished guests, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on wherever you are. I'm Park Jong-kwon, the chairman of Arts Council Korea. Thank you for your interest and participation in 2022 ARKO International Symposium. To lay the foundation for Korean art in the international arena, Arts Council Korea has been engaged in multi-year cooperation programs with Germany and Denmark since the start of the cooperation with the British Arts Council, or Arts Council England in 2016, with Singapore from 2019 to 2021, and the Netherlands from 2000 to 2020 to this year. This 2022 ARKO International Symposium, which confirms partnerships with overseas organizations that have been promoting collaborative projects with ARKO and further revitalizes reciprocal cooperation, was held in March last year under the theme of Reconnection, and this year's symposium, which marks the 5th anniversary, is with the theme of Rethink, Imagine, and Act. I would like to thank Mr. Sam Harvey, Director of the British Council Korea, Marla Stukenberg, Director of Goethe-Intitut Korea, Einar Jansen, a Danish ambassador to Korea, Rosa Daniela, Chairwoman of the Singapore National Arts Council, Renilde Steeghs, Acting Director of DutchCulture, for their unsparing support for this symposium despite their busy schedules. I also want to express my sincere gratitude to the speakers at home and abroad for their presence. The world is now gradually returning to normal after over 2 years of physical isolation. The pandemic has, over the past 2 years, brought unprecedented challenges that have shaken our lives, ranging from the most fundamental mobility of our lives to every detail of individuals' lives and the social institutions. This unprecedented common experience around the world made us look back on the history and world we have walked through and ask questions about the sustainable life. At a time when the pandemic is coming to an end, ARKO International Symposium this year is to look at the world we live in and show us the world we must create with the imagination of art and propose to act with art. On day one, under the subthemes of creative friction, the action and question for the future that art imagines, artist creative action, creative friction, the symposium will look at a society that is becoming frictionless, where only convenience is pursued, along with the advances of polarization and technology, and consider how art creates resistance and thought through creative friction and creates creative criticism, and how the entire humanity is facing hyper issues such as climate crisis. We will also look at the current situation and listen in the stories and experiences from domestic, international artists, and experts on the way forward. On day two, under the subtheme of artist creative action post anthropocentrism, we will consider that this is a time when an active discussion of posthumanism beyond anthropocentrism is needed. The symposium will present a non-human narrative through reflection on various topics. In addition, the symposium will also address the experiences of cultural and art support organizations representing each country regarding the value of art for a sustainable society and ideas for new connections. Art is the force that sustains possibility. Through this symposium, we would like to discuss the role of art for global sustainability and to share and encourage action based on artistic imagination. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to the partner organizations of the ARKO Joint Arts Fund programs for their dedicated cooperation for the successful implementation of the symposium. I wish every one of you good health and happiness. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson Park, for your opening remark. This symposium has been held in partnership with the International Joint Fund, so including the Art Council England, National Arts Council Singapore, Goethe-Intitut, Danish Agency for Culture and Palaces, and DutchCulture. Next, the Renilde Steeghs, Acting Director of the DutchCulture, And the Marla Stukenberg, director of the Goethe-Intitut, have sent us the welcoming remarks, so please watch them.
Dear friends in Korea and all across the globe, on behalf of DutchCulture Center for International Cooperation from Amsterdam, I would like to address a few words to you at the opening of your symposium. In the past 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we live, work, and engage with each other all over the world. And I'm very happy that our partner, Arts Council Korea, organizes this hybrid gathering looking into the renewed global ecology of arts and culture. We are glad to contribute from the Netherlands to introduce Dutch experiences and initiatives in the thinking of the dynamic between art and society, climate and technology. Last year, the Netherlands and South Korea celebrated their 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations. On this great occasion, DutchCulture and the Arts Council Korea set up the International Joint Arts Fund Program to support Dutch-Korean cultural collaboration. Despite of the pandemic and travel restrictions, we are inspired to see a good many new collaborative projects between artists from both our countries in a variety of disciplines. And later this year, there will be a series of presentations of these projects taking place in Korea and the Netherlands. Here, I would like to take the opportunity to invite you all to enjoy the results of our most special partnership with the Arts Council Korea. Once again, I hope you will all enjoy the exchange and dialogues at the symposium in the coming 2 days. And I hope we can meet physically again very soon. Thank you.
On behalf of the Goethe-Intitut Korea, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the ARKO Online International Symposium. As we are now hopefully entering a new phase post-COVID-19, the ARKO International Symposium is addressing very important questions that need to be further discussed or even reconsidered from a different perspective. In our societies today, everything is increasingly determined by technology. The COVID pandemic has made us even more dependent on technology to connect and to maintain communication. Art and culture are the fields where these developments, new perspectives, and innovative thoughts can be communicated and addressed. Since art and culture can facilitate communication between people as well as create new connections, this symposium is an opportunity to ask, answer, and discuss further questions that are urgent to humankind. For example, the question of sustainability and climate change should also be addressed in the field of art. At this point, I would like to share with you a personal experience that had a very special meaning for me. A few years ago in Bangkok, the Goethe-Intitut Thailand opened the International Science Film Festival with a very special film, Chasing Ice, an award-winning documentary film by Jeff Orlovsky. The film portrays the work of James Bullock, who has been documenting the melting of glaciers in Greenland and elsewhere for several years. With a time-lapse camera, we watch the melting and the massive breakaway of the glaciers in this film. It must be said that this film is based on scientific findings and measurements, but I found it gains its real power from the incredible images and thus from art. Due to the artistic quality of this film, the topic has really reached and gripped me personally. And global warming, climate change, the importance of sustainability, all this was really in front of my eyes in all its dimension and in its importance through this particular film. How can artists and cultural institutions contribute to sustainable development? I'm very pleased that the Arts Council Korea is giving international experts the space to discuss this important aspect within this symposium. I wish the further course of this symposium many inspiring moments and insights into the impact of the post-pandemic on art and technology, as well as on art and sustainability and other pressing aspects of our time.
Thank you for your warm greetings. This symposium has been organized as a part of the ARKO International Art Joint Fund project. The International Art Joint Fund project was launched in year 2016 as the Arts Council Korea established a joint fund with the British Council Korea and Arts Council England. And since then, the project has been a centerpiece of ARKO's international exchange programs and contributed a lot to uncover various international joint collaboration projects. So let us watch a short video on this International Art Joint Fund project. Let us now begin the main part of the symposium. So this will be the keynote session. And the theme of this year's symposium is the creative friction and also act with imagination for future. So I believe that the theme of this symposium is pretty inspiring. I'm sure that everyone knows about what friction is, and by coincidence, we actually have a professor who majored in physics. So what is friction? In terms of the classical mechanics, the friction refers to the force of interference for everything. So in that sense, it sounds pretty negative, but this symposium has the title of the friction, and I believe this is very meaningful and significant because without friction, there is no movement on the earth. And therefore, friction does it have some constructive power. And therefore, by taking advantage of the power of friction in a positive manner, we can actually open a new future. And in the sense, I believe that the friction does have various meanings, both positive and negative. And as you said, I believe that the friction can also lead to various impacts. For example, heat, sound, or sometimes light as well. And I believe that the size and the magnitude of such impact would vary based on what kind of objects are involved. And the reason that we are talking about this friction is because I believe that art could have interaction with various things, including politics, plants, and also animals on the earth, as well as the group of knowledges, the assemblies of knowledge. And in that sense, I believe the art could have a diverse interactions. And that's why we have titled this symposium as friction. And I believe the friction will be the force that will enrich the artistic world. And I believe this is one of the intent as well as the belief that the ARKO has held when coming up with this and designing for this international symposium. And in this sense, we will have presenters for this session. Let me first invite the first speaker of the session. So Dr. Lee Sang-wook, professor of the Department of Philosophy and AI of Hanyang University, and he's going to talk about the post-humanism that we are going to live. So from the post-humanism perspective, he will be talking about the future that we will all live.
Thank you very much. When I was invited into the symposium, I had such a high expectation for this one because post-humanism is important as a philosophical discourse, but it has great interfaces with a great number of interfaces with art and other sectors in the society. So this is a great opportunity for me to observe directly what artists are doing in this field and on this subject. Since I am the first speaker, I would like to share with you the existing approach to post-humanism and how that is affecting the response to post-humanism and various challenges of the society. I believe this subject is closely related to artificial intelligence, which is quite a hot topic these days. Artificial intelligence or AI produces such a great result and outcome, but it is very unfamiliar intellect, which is quite different from human intellect. That is why it has great implications for post-humanism. That picture is the music piece of an AI composer. Although I cannot play that, just like next Rembrandt, AI has been widely used quite actively in various artistic disciplines. So this testifies to the advances in AI and AI technology. Let me first define what humanism is. Humanism is also defined as a human-centric idea, and this does not have any clear definition throughout the history. Although now we have a rather shared view on humanism. Humanism, and we believe that that has been consistent throughout the history, even from the ancient Greco-Roman era, emphasizing civic capacity and virtues to perform public arts. But the idea and the concept of humanism in the time of Leonardo da Vinci is quite different from that of a French Revolution, because back then in the day of Leonardo da Vinci, the concept of universal and inalienable human rights was not there at all. So my point here is that human-centric idea and a humanistic idea we take for granted in the face of the post-humanism is being redefined, but the concept of humanism has been evolving constantly and has been redefined constantly over time throughout history. Although we talk about post-humanism, that doesn't mean that we have to deny the values of humanism. We have to eliminate the values and we have to undermine the dignity of a human being. It's not really that radical. In fact, post-humanism continues part of the tradition of humanism, which is to re-examine the values of humanism over and over again, whether this is valid and whether this is justifiable in the 21st century. What is the dignity of a human being? Is only human being dignified, or is there any other living form which needs to be dignified and which should be recognized for its dignity? So this is the approach of the post-humanism. Humanism actually criticized modernism, but rather than eliminating all the values, humanism enriched modernism. Post-humanism is taking quite a similar approach there. This is the river of Ganges. There was an attempt to grant and bestow legal personification to the river of Ganges. those people who root for the change is not because they believe the river of Ganges can think and can be aware of the environment, but rather than that, because the river is so polluted and contaminated, those activists wanted to preserve the river. If it is given any legal personality, then they can better protect the river. So in running the society, humans and non-humans are treated quite differently, but rather than taking this dichotomous approach, post-humanism considers that there might be something in between, like companies or legal entities, which can be given with the rights, just like human beings to a certain extent. And if that is allowed, then what will be the boundaries? This is what is considered by the post-humanistic idea. And this has been highlighted because of the climate change and climate crisis. Climate crisis affect the entire globe. And human beings are the only ones who can actively respond to this. And in that process, not just the rights and the profits and the interest of the human beings, we have to also consider the interest as well as the rights of the environment in order to ensure that we need to have more comprehensive post-humanistic idea and post-humanistic approach. So post-humanism is not denying the value of human beings, is not denying the existence of human beings, but this is to confront challenges of the 21st century in a more efficient and effective manner in order to effectively respond to those challenges. Let me talk more about AIs. Why do we talk about AIs? I believe AI can be one of the ways to expand boundaries of post-humanism because AI challenges our intellectual capabilities. We believe that we are the Lord of creation. We have the most advanced intellect. And we also believe that since you are artists, humans are the only ones who can create art in the most advanced forms. Because human beings prevail over other beings, so human beings can't reign in and can't ignore other beings. Such an anthropocentristic idea has been dominant, but Neanderthalensis became extinct 40,000 years ago. And since then, humans have been the most advanced and most intellectual ones. So over that 40,000 years, humans became to believe that if you are intellectual, then you are stronger than others. And you can overpower others, all other beings on earth. And you might have seen this before, but this is what is called the next Rembrandt, the artificial intelligence learned how Rembrandt would have painted a work. Since the painterly style was so Rembrandt-like, even experts were amazed to see this piece, but the AI itself was not aware of what it was doing. AI is a massive machine which can do the integral calculus. And engineers came up with an advanced algorithm to do such a job. So it does not have any human consideration. It does not consider the volumes. It does not consider anything. Without human awareness, the final outcome sometimes is superior to the human's work. So the emergence of such an intellect is something we have to focus more on. So with such a rapid development of the intelligence, then we might be, the entire human being might be under a serious threat. The superintelligence might come to surface, posing a serious challenge to human beings. Such a scenario has been repeated over and over again. But rather than considering those scenarios one by one, we have to remember that the way AI functions is based on calculation. That's it. So if you look at the super intelligence, the basis is that if you can calculate faster, then the AI will become more intelligent. AI's computational power will go up exponentially. The GPU will go up, and AI will do the calculation much faster than before. With the higher hardware capacity and the capability, the intelligence would climb exponentially. But according to many intelligence studies, well, it is found that it is almost groundless. When we say something is intelligent or someone is intelligent, the mathematics is not the only outlet for the expression of such an intelligence. There are some people who are really extremely good at interpersonal skills, the social intelligence, and some are really good at artistic intelligence, and some people are very balanced in terms of their physical capabilities. So there are so many ways to be smart in the 21st century society. And in our brain, well, each section takes care of the relevant part or relevant capability. So with the advances in AI, we will have a very advanced computational capability, and AI is very faster in doing calculation than us. But in other areas, AI is far behind us. So I believe the theory behind the superintelligence is so simple, maybe too simple. But the people believe that we might see some superintelligence because we feel the existential risks. But I believe that's all wrong, because although the result of AI's work is very excellent and superior, AI does not understand the meaning of the outcome, meaning of the result. AI is not a human-like semantic machine. It mimics semantic machine. If you try to talk to AI chatbot, then AI chatbot does not understand your question, but it automatically comes up with an answer based on the calculation of the probability in each situation. So it does performance without awareness. So it is quite different from human artist. And the second point is failure that we cannot properly understand. AI makes mistakes, but because it is not perfect, sometimes it is not perfect, it makes some mistakes, although their frequency or the probability of failure is much lower than that of a human. But when the AI makes a mistake, then we cannot properly understand why such a mistake is made. So let's take a look at this image. Well, on the right side, you can see the school bus. Then the AI would properly understand why this is a school bus. Then if undecipherable noise is inserted, which is called adversarial perturbation, then though we can see that whether on the right side or on the left side, we can see a school bus. AI says on the left side, that is ostrich. It does not recognize it as a school bus. Rather than that, it recognizes it as an ostrich. Why? Although the school bus is in a totally different category than ostrich, AI does not have any common sense knowledge. as to those categories. So, although AI recognizes the first image as a school bus, that is not because it knows the characteristics of a school bus. It is because it does a good calculation to perform the accurate calculation. So it is hard to grasp for us to this. Without understanding, AI performs a certain task. Its way of functioning is totally different from the way of human functioning. That is why we cannot understand why it makes such a failure. At times, the last point is also important. Well, people tend to think that humanoid or android robots in science fiction movies are typical AI, but it is important that AI itself does not have a body. It works and operates in a cyberspace. That means that there should be an actuator which implements the outcome of a calculation done by AI, and that actuator, in most of the cases, is human beings. Then let me take an example of next Rembrandt. AI drew a painting, a very Rembrandt-like one, but in reality, it didn't go like this one. Well, it was not like that. An engineer told the AI to go to Rox Museum, which accommodates a lot of Rembrandt's paintings, and order it to draw a Rembrandt-like painting after hours and hours of practice. No, it didn't work that way. AI engineers worked with Rembrandt experts and identified various variables over such a long time, which capture the characteristics of the Rembrandt's paintings. And based on this variables, all the Rembrandt's paintings were put into coding, which were translated into numbers, pixel by pixel, and the AI was trained in those codes, and then three-dimensional calculation is done pixel by pixel in numbers, in numerical figures. Then the expert and the engineers do the coding to turn those numbers into pixel by pixel painting, and then 3D printer is connected to the AI. That's how we have the Rembrandt-like painting done by next Rembrandt. But that means that although we believe so many things have been done by AI alone cannot do anything by itself. So in the sense, AI is limited to the cyberspace only. What does this mean? I believe this is very important in this symposium. First is quite obvious. Whether we like it or not, AI will be widely used and will become extremely important going forward. Then, we should not try to personify it, to see that it works like a human, it performs like a human. That leads to a great confusion. We have to recognize that AI is an unfamiliar intellect. In running AI and interacting with AI, what does that mean? AI does not have any feelings, emotions, or awareness. It's only a machine. So AI is there to make our world safer. And to that end, we have to consider how to communicate and interact with machines rather than blindly applying human-centric values to the machines. I'm not saying that we have to treat objects as human beings. Rather than that, we have to consider how to interact and communicate with the object. And I think this is one of the very important topics in the post-humanism. And another question we have to consider is, since the extinction of Neanderthalensis, we always believe that intellect is human intellect. But there are different types of intelligence, human intelligence and artificial or machine intelligence. But we also have to accept the possibility that conscious experience, which is very precious to us, is ontologically contingent. What does that mean? It is very important and precious to human beings, but it is not a must for all beings out there. So this is another possibility we have to consider. That is the photo of the galaxy, and the Earth is not at the center of the galaxy. At the center is the black hole. So it's in the far corner of the galaxy. Humans are amazing beings, but from the perspective of the universe, humans might be the outcome of contingency or repeated contingencies and cultural effects in the post-humanistic era. So we have to take this kind of approach in understanding where we should be and how should we react. Thank you very much for your presentation. As a philosopher in science, Professor Lee talked about the beings we have to consider in our day-to-day lives. And there is another one who also considers the same point. I'd like to invite Director Kate Mitchell for her presentation. She is known for her great works, which are quite revolutionary over the past few years. On the subject of climate change, she has created various productions. Let me invite her for her keynote speech.
Hello, it's a privilege to join your symposium today, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between theatre and climate change. I've been working on this relationship for 11 years, and over that time I have directed 7 productions on the subject. I want to start by talking to you about my first contact with the subject of climate change 11 years ago, as I hope it will invite you into the artistic process behind creating a production about this difficult and important subject. So, 11 years ago, in 2011, I met a scientist from Cambridge University, a professor of computational science called Stephen Emmett. The meeting was part of an initiative by the National Theatre in London to encourage science and the arts to work together. I had absolutely no idea what I would encounter. I found myself sitting at dinner with Stephen, a 50-year-old man from the north of England, and he told me that there was only one thing to talk about. What is that? I asked, completely naively, and he began to tell me what was happening with the environment. We were, he said, and this was the first time I had ever heard the phrase, we were facing an unprecedented planetary emergency. He was so incredibly angry that no one believed the science about climate change and that no one was doing anything about it. He even told me he had been an advisor to the UK government, but no one was listening there either. Remember that in 2011, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, had only issued 4 reports, and none of them had categorically linked human activity to climate change. That was only something to come much later on in 2019. So Stephen's main concern at the time was about convincing people that climate change was real and actually happening. The information he shared with me was completely overwhelming. He told me about extreme population growth, the future collapse of food and water supplies, the start of mass extinctions, the arrival of a period of unstable weather systems as a prelude to a warming of the whole planet, and mass migrations of people on a scale that was unimaginable 11 years ago. When he spoke about the way that hundreds of migrants would cross the British Channel on small boats to get into the UK, I just couldn't process what he was saying. I simply couldn't imagine it. He said that science was failing to do anything about it politically, and that the scientists needed the arts community to help them communicate the problem. He looked me in the eye and he told me that my daughter's future was at risk. Indeed, everyone's children were at risk. The information he told me was devastating, and I believed him. I went home afterwards and quietly opened the door to my daughter's bedroom and stood watching her sleep. What the fuck am I going to do? I thought. The next day, I didn't really stop to process the feelings. That would come later. I just went straight into action. I realised from the get-go that this enormous bomb of information that had exploded in my life was going to require me to change as a person, as an artist, and as a citizen. First, I tried to convert my feelings about the situation into right artistic action. I set up an away weekend with all the scientists in Stephen's Microsoft laboratory in Cambridge and key artists working in the UK, set designers, producers, architects, lighting designers, composers. Then I put in motion a series of workshops at the National Theatre to work together with Stephen and investigate ways of communicating what was happening to the environment. As I was doing all of this, I also began to reflect on what I could do as a citizen as well as an artist. I wanted to reduce my carbon footprint. At that point, I was working between the UK and mainland Europe, and I was taking about 30 or 40 flights a year. So after a lot of reflection, I decided to stop flying and start taking trains instead. This decision signalled a radical change in my travel and my working life. Stopping flying was completely mad, given the nature of my career, and totally exhausting. But at least I was able to look myself in the eye, in the mirror, in the morning, and say to myself, you are doing something to mitigate what is happening. Meanwhile, the workshops at the National Theatre in London moved forwards. In those workshops, Stephen Emmett would share scientific information about climate change, and we would try to find a theatrical form with which to communicate that information. We tried inventing a lot of scenes, which in the end would have better belonged in American disaster movies. I remember one such scene set in the future where a mother and son sat in a small rowing boat policing the coastline of the UK against migrants. We were trying to explore how climate change and the mass migrations it would create could make our country more fascist and isolated. But we all knew in our heart of hearts that scenes like this just didn't get close to communicating the subject matter. And however hard we tried, we just couldn't find a form to encapsulate the scale of what Stephen told us was happening. Indeed, we began to notice how the subject of climate change resists representation. The scope is too vast and the set of factors involved are too intricate to be easily realised on stage. Years later, I was to read the work of Timothy Morton, a professor in English who explores the intersection of object-orientated thought and ecological studies. He described climate change as a hyper-object, a phenomenon massively distributed in time and space relative to humans and therefore hard to comprehend and represent. And I think this is such a useful way of thinking about it. Back then in 2011, in our workshops at the National Theatre, we were struggling with this hyper-object. We kept trying to incorporate these complex environmental issues within an interpersonal drama, because that was the theatrical form we were used to. But again and again, we realised that this approach risked reinforcing the anthropocentrism that had got human beings into this climate mess in the first place. We were just falling back on the tradition of human exceptionalism of Western dramatic theatre. Is this an intractable problem, we asked ourselves. We also found ourselves asking bigger questions about the role of theatre. Can theatre transform attitudes towards climate change and the more than human world? What dramaturgical strategies are most efficacious for communicating the environmental message? How can theatre adapt its politics of production as well as its politics of representation? We worked with a group of exceptional actors. We were helped by extraordinary playwrights like Carol Churchill and Martin Crimp. We were even supported by the government in a visit by Ed Miliband, who was at that point the shadow environment minister for the Labour Party. We brought in sound designers, composers, video specialists, but we just couldn't find a path through the subject to a viable performance. One afternoon, after months of work, Stephen Emmett was visiting us again to watch some scenes we had made. I saw his disappointment in our attempts, and then I suddenly had a moment of revelation. I realised that the solution to the whole experiment was sitting there in front of me. Bingo! Why hadn't I thought of it before? I know what we should do, I said. We should put the scientist on stage. If we put the scientist on stage, then people will have to believe the science. Finally, we had found a theatrical form for our hyper-object. and we called it a lecture performance. 10 billion. We began to work on a production that was later to be called 10 billion. Carol Churchill and Stephen Emmett came up with that title as Stephen was keen to have population growth at the centre of the text. At that time, the population was 7 billion, and 10 billion was the projected human population for the end of the century. So how did we make the show? Well, the main aim was to communicate the science in a way that a layperson could understand its complexity. So Stephen worked with a dramaturg, Lindsay Turner, and Lindsay put all the scientific information into a dramaturgical structure that an everyday non-scientific audience could understand. Lindsay also guided Stephen to use simpler and non-scientific language with which to communicate the science. We set the performance lecture in a reconstruction of Stephen's office in Cambridge, and we used video animation to communicate the steps of the narrative. The production turned out to be very depressing. At the end of it, Stephen offered 2 personal reflections. He spoke about a recent conversation he had had with a young Scottish scientist in his laboratory who had just had a baby. Stephen asked this young scientist what, in the light of his knowledge about climate change, he would teach his child. And the young scientist replied, to use a gun. Stephen then told us that, in his opinion, we were fucked. He had absolutely no hope that anything would be done to stop the unprecedented planetary emergency we were in. The production sold out and was voted Best Production 2012 by the Guardian newspaper. Members of the government also came, and we were also asked if there was a video of the performance to help the British Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, get to grips with the subject matter. But the audience response was diverse, from acceptance to robust denial, from people vowing to change their lives to others refusing to believe what Stephen was saying. So afterwards, the production left us with many questions and doubts. I realised that presenting the facts about climate change as we had done generated a lot of fear in the audience, and that this fear pushed people towards denial. In fact, I learned that fear was an ineffective tool for motivating genuine personal engagement. Furthermore, the view Stephen expressed at the end of all of us being fucked or doomed did not allow any room for mitigating action, suggesting in effect to audiences that they need not bother. Finally, we realised that this show was also carbon heavy. The set, the 2 laptops we used, countless personal belongings. In the end, the piece risked suggesting that nothing can be done about climate change on the level of human behaviour, whilst all the while consuming more of the scarce resources that Emmett's discussion highlighted. These observations led us to make 2 pieces with the writer Duncan Macmillan, Lungs and 2071. In the first, Lungs, we wanted to cohere the content, the performance form, and the means of production, and most importantly, to reduce our carbon footprint. Lungs. Lungs is a play about a young cis couple working out whether to have a baby or not in the context of the environmental crises. We performed the show off-grid in Berlin in 2013. All the electricity for the lighting and sound were generated live as part of the performance. The 2 actors rode stationary bikes to power the lights to light their faces and to power the small microphones mounted on the handlebars of the bikes. The audience were asked to watch this hard physical ordeal of the actors cycling with the sweat, the effortful breathing, the muscular pain and so on, whilst listening to the couple discuss whether to have a child or not. The set and the curtains were made from recycled materials. We also had 4 other cyclists powering a small video projector showing an algorithm of the number of babies born over the 73 minutes of the performance. The show had a positive ending in that the couple decided to have a child, but once the child was born, the text started to fast forward and you saw how that child was catapulted over the course of his life into the environmental catastrophe. After Lungs, we worked with another scientist, Professor Chris Rapley, on another performance lecture staged in London in 2014. This time, we did not use a naturalistic set, but we just put the scientist on a chair with minimal projections behind to illustrate the points he was making. That way we reduced our carbon footprint. Chris worked with the playwright Duncan in the same way that Stephen Emmett had worked with Lindsay Turner, but this time we were all aware of the dangers of frightening the audience and were therefore keen to order and communicate the science in a way that would invite people more into the subject matter. Chris and Duncan created a text called 2071, which looked at how scientists measure climate change, how they measure rises in sea level, ice melting, and so on. And the production also identified what everyone could do in their private lives and as citizens to mitigate against 2 degrees of planetary warming. The tone and content of this production was more thoughtful, mindful of the way the audiences can shut down when faced with the subject matter, and as a result, the response was more constructive, with audiences grateful for the way the information had been unfolded and for the advice on the action they could take. 2071 ended our experimentation with the lecture performance, but because we began to realise that a continued emphasis on facts was somewhat misguided. Information alone does not persuade those who still deny the existence of climate change, whilst those who do accept the facts are not galvanised to act through more exposure to graphs and figures. So the next production I directed about climate change, I returned to the existing theatrical canon. I directed Samuel Beckett's play Happy Days through the prism of climate change. Happy Days is a play about a woman in a post-apocalyptic landscape where she is buried up to her waist in earth and keeps behaving as if nothing has happened. In the second half, she is buried up to her neck and still acts as if everything were normal. Instead of setting the play in earth, in our production, the action of the play was set in a flooded domestic kitchen to draw attention to how climate change is upon us, but we are acting as if nothing is happening. The original play spoke to our post-war anxiety about nuclear annihilation, but in our production in 2019, we replaced that anxiety with our current environmental fear of being subsumed literally and existentially by our environment, or no longer being at the heart of the human-centered world. By showing how the character was literally being swallowed up in the more than human force of nature, water, we wanted the audiences to feel the encroaching realities of climate change. So this time, the production wanted to target emotion, not the intellect, and to give focus to the environment itself. After this, there was a gap of a few years as I run aground a bit, couldn't think how to move the subject forward in theatre. Then the pandemic arrived, adding renewed focus to my work on climate change, and I made 3 pieces of work in quick succession. First, I worked with an orchestra, the London Sinfonietta, and the composer Laura Bowler and playwright Cordelia Lynn on a new music piece about climate change called Houses Slide. The piece combined verbatim text about people's feelings about climate change with text exploring eco-psychology, or how we process the information about climate change. The concert was staged at the Royal Festival Hall in 2021, and it was off-grid, powered by 16 cyclists, including the soprano who sung the text. The cyclists powered the electricity to light the show and the sound system to represent the recordings of people speaking about climate change and the electronic sound component of the composition. After this, I worked with the playwright Chris Bush about a play on the subject of the hyper-object. This was an experimental text where a job interview between a young scientist and a professor of climate science is played out in many different iterations to explore the impossibility of grasping the subject. Again, the production was powered by 2 cyclists and performed at the Schaubühne Theatre in Berlin. Also in 2021, I worked with the Vidi Theatre in Lausanne and the choreographer Jerome Bell to invent a touring production where there was no travel involved in the making or the touring of the show. I directed an eco-feminist text by the American playwright Miranda Rose Hall, a play for the living at a time of extinction. I directed the whole production via Zoom. I sat in my home in London rehearsing with the performers via Zoom in Lausanne. After the performance in Lausanne ended, no people and no materials moved to the next city. Instead, the play text was emailed to another local director in another European city who worked with local performers to shape another iteration of the same text. Certain parameters were agreed to. The new local director had to stage all the texts, had to cast a person of colour, had to use only 150 watts of electricity, and must show the powering of the electricity as part of the performance. But aside from these parameters, the new local artist was free to work on the production however they wanted to, and I relinquished control of the original show that I had made to that local artist. This project, with the overarching title Sustainable Theatre, is currently still touring without travelling in Europe. Now I'm working on a new production, positioning the more than human world at the centre of a production by directing Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard from the point of view of the trees. This means cutting much of the text or hearing sections of it at a distance or at speed as characters walk through the orchard. This production will be an enormous experiment to explore what happens when the more than human world, in this instance a cherry orchard, replaces our anthropocentric theatrical focus, and whether what we are left with can be theatrical in any way. Furthermore, I am working on an off-grid version of the opera Tosca, where the opera is powered by 30 female cyclists. This is still at the planning stage. I hope that my description of my personal journey with the intersection between theatre and ecology has provided you with some useful reflections on how we can represent this unprecedented planetary emergency. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Now, for the last presentation of this session, we would like to invite Jarl Schulp, Creative Director and co-founder of the Dutch-based Viva Festival. Actually, the Viva Festival is going to be open tomorrow, so he will be extremely busy, but he has been joining us, so please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jarl Schulp, and I'm the Artistic Director of Fiber. We're an Amsterdam-based festival and platform for digital culture, technology, and in relation to ecology and environmental issues. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And today I will present to you what our organization is doing and what we try to achieve with the work that we do. A little introduction. Fiber is based in Amsterdam. We host different performance programs, but also lectures and conferences. And here you can see our festival, which happened in 2020 in the pandemic. And this was also an opportunity for us to do a lot of our remote programs and events. So we have a lecture-based event series. We run concert also and conference programs, and most of them are connected to relationship between technology and ecology and the place that humans have within the planet, on the planet, and how they see themselves situated within an ecological environment, or as we say, in an ecology. Separate from the festival, we run several labs, which are very important for us because they give us the opportunity to really bring together different disciplines that are working together in the field of arts, science, technology, philosophy, anthropology. And through these labs, we also develop a lot of installations that tap into certain ecological issues. And I will tell you more about in my presentation. Because we're finding ourselves in a moment which is absolutely devastating and nerve-wracking, I could say. And this has been also nicely shown with this picture of Christy Meuclair, where she shows that while the rest of the world is having a very big impact of climate change and the global warming, life is continuing as we see it. And we're having a hard time to grasp what is actually happening while it's still happening under our nose. Recently also, not happening within the global south, but also in Europe, we see the impact of climate change being more severe recently, also with the droughts and the flooding. And lately, this was happening also in Germany, where big parts of the river just were washed away due to this very high tide water. But as we are talking about the impact of climate change or global warming, as we might better say, often we see the data that's being harvested on it as being presented to us within graphs. So through the media or through scientific papers. And for a lot of people, it's very hard to understand and to read these papers while they contain very valid and very important information. The general population has a hard time reading them, and also it doesn't so much speak to the emotions. So here, as we can see, also we see the biodiversity loss, which is happening at a rate which is unprecedented. But how do we communicate this to the audience, and how do we change our audience and perception into their place in the world and how they are related to their environment, and actually their life and their actions are entangled with their environment. And this is where the arts come into place. And I think it's a very interesting work by Christelle Vu and Julian Oliver, where they literally make tangible or make sonify the impact of this extinction rate. So for instance, this work, the gong is heard every time a new species goes extinct. And they are connecting this to the database where the official organization tracks these changes in the database. But every time a new extinct animal is logged into the database, this gong is heard in the space. So it's a very powerful way of to amplify and sonify this kind of data about the world that we might think is maybe too abstract sometimes. Here we have the opportunity also to understand hyperobjects, like the eco-philosopher Timothy Morton, is introducing, which are objects or systems that are too big and too hard to grasp for us humans, because they span over such a different time and space. For instance, the internet could be seen as an hyperobject, but also climate change could be seen as a hyperobject, that it doesn't act the same way in the place where something is manifested. Something happens maybe 10 years later or in a different part of the world. So in that sense, they're very hard to understand. And that's also why global warming and the ecological crisis that comes with it is so hard to understand. Projects like the legal status ice from Irene Stracuzzi that we work with show also these kind of hyperobject systems on a smaller scale. And for instance, here we see sort of the battle over the Arctic, now that the Arctic is melting, where different countries are interested in oil, gas, and other resources that are spread out over the continent. And it's very interesting through these works to see this almost invisible or cloaked actions that countries have, and how it indeed is changing our landscape. Or how satellites are passing over the Earth, as Satellieten from Quadrature shows, where every time a satellite comes by, there's a robot that draws a line on the map, making it within almost a day, fully black square on the map, which is quite unprecedented. So I want to tell you a little bit about Cartographies of the Vanishing Now, one of the projects we did at Fiber, which gives us the opportunity to ask a few core questions. So how can we relate to the reality of climate change in other ways, visual or embodied? And so how can we relate to its impact, origin, and its complexity? What role can sensory art, design, mapping, and performative actions play in addressing these questions? And can we use multi-sensory composition and image making as a speculative tool, or as a sort of new way of thinking? And this is what we tried to set out to do with one of our case studies, which is the storm surge barrier in the Netherlands, which is heralded as a big engineering project from the Netherlands. And it's actually also a very interesting project. And it has made the Netherlands as it is now because it keeps the water out and creates new land. But at the same time, also it changes the inner ecology of that space because there's actually like a membrane between the in and the outside sea. And this changes the local economy a lot. And this is quite often unseen and outside of the human eye. So here we see the impact of this storm surge barrier, and it creates a completely dead ecosystem. And one algae species takes over, and at that moment, we see that there's no space for other non-humans to live there. So these field trips are very important for us. We take the resources and the samples and observations back to the lab, and then we're prototyping different types of installations and have discussions about what kind of new critical assemblies can we create between humans and non-human actors. And here you see that we also spend a lot of time in the field, seeing the landscape go over different stages of the day. And with this, we can create a different understanding of like day rhythms and night rhythms and how different animals live there and different plants are active during day or night, and creating a very different landscape relationship with this landscape. We also take soil samples on this field trip to understand also how the landscape is constructed with different sort of layers of earth. So what can we learn when we travel back through time? Because each layer actually is a time zone. And through digging into the earth, we can really feel and understand all the layers of sort of the earth cake and which layer is what kind of time frame. And also we understand the landscape differently or try to sense the landscape differently through drone photography and creating different types of maps, which often are used in the lab for backdrops or resources to tell different stories within these kind of virtual landscapes. So a lot of it comes down to mapping and mapping in different sorts. So very rudimentary mapping of physical mapping with your hands to kind of more high-end video and scanning photography. And through this kind of acts of mapping, we also create sort of imprints or different visualizations of the landscapes we explore. And here then we come up with, as we said, the moment of cartography. And often that happens with a lot of discussion between different participants. And through mapping and cartographing the environment, you create a very different understanding of it. It makes it possible to zoom in or zoom out on these places we visit and to create a different view literally on them. But a lot of it is also a data side. So what kind of data can we harvest from weather patterns, from water patterns that are accumulated over time? And this is also in collaboration with scientific institutes that offers the opportunity to often dive into these data sets, but maybe then to sonify them and to bring them back into a different artistic environment where they create different impacts. So they speak to the senses and to the body, creating different types of emotions. So this translation between data and emotions is a very interesting one and is quite essential to one of the labs that we did. We call it sensory storytelling, and through sensory storytelling, we can connect sort of data spaces to the listening body. And I can also show a little bit of the sort of stories that we then tell and the environments that we build. And separately also, it's the analyzation of different matters. Here is a project which took a lot of algae and tried to break the algae down into different color components, which can be used then in the end to work in the design project. So you can create a map through different types of colors, which is also based on one of our co-curators, Cassandra van der Eyck. She has quite a lot of knowledge in this space. So also together with her, our participants learn these kind of techniques, how to break down material also in pigments and use that in design projects. And here you can see, for instance, one of the processes. The important part of the lab is also the theoretical backbone, which is coming from spaces of eco-fiction, eco-philosophy, science, and it helps us also to ground our work in the scholar work of great thinkers that have already been discussing and exploring these topics. And for instance, one of the artistic outcomes of the lab, which I can show you also, which is still also a sort of small prototype, is a project from Mark IJzerman, who's also one of the co-founders of the lab, where he also uses scans of barnacles and combines that with a GTP2 artificial intelligence that is trained on a data set from barnacles, but also science fiction. And by changing a few parameters within the artificial intelligence, you can come up with very interesting sort of small stories about how the non-humans might be looking at humans.
Humans are sessile animals, meaning they are immobile, and will not move from the position they are in for the rest of their lives. Because they are sessile animals, they are very vulnerable to predation by other animals, or by what they call natural disasters, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, very often triggered by their own stupidity.
So this is really where we get into the space of speculation through these different techniques and technologies, but it gives a very interesting perspective on how we are connected to other forms of life, or how we are connected to a rock, because with this artificial intelligence, you can also give a rock a voice. And this makes a sort of decentering the human in this is a very interesting sort of way of telling stories. And one of the projects that also came out of a few of the labs, which was co-commissioned by Fiber and other cultural organizers, is the project Models for Environmental Literacy from Tiffin Rice. And I will play a short clip which also introduces the project and what it actually tries to do.
Models for Environmental Literacy.
What is an island? Is it a graveyard? In what sense is it an island? Does an island denote a sense of spatial absence?
I'm afraid of the absence. It seems to be forming on me. Its dark forms disturb me. The whole place silent. The stones are a blur.
All of this anxiety and worry goes hand in hand with an ongoing process of change. A change that, although not explicitly recognized by this program, has become obvious to all.
So here we see the work, which are 3 artificial agents, AI agents, that are discussing with each other what is a landscape and what does nature mean to them. And it's very fascinating to see these 3 AIs having conversations that are sometimes very fantasy-like, but sometimes also very close to our reality. But they also bring up conversations of things that we might not have thought of. So here you can see that we can use technology as also a critical sort of reflection, and we can use it maybe as sort of a mirror that comes up with different perceptions of nature and different stories about nature. I want to also introduce Reassemble, which is a follow-up lab that we're currently doing with Fiber. And it uses the techniques of world building to come up with fictional worlds. So where we position these technologies then into speculative worlds. So how can we create worlds where really the human is decentered and other forms of life take the center stage or are given the center stage? And this goes very much to sort of climate imagination as a critical practice. And here we also collaborated with the Climaginaries project from the University of Lund, which speculates about a world without fossil fuels. And one of the projects is called Carbon Runes, and it shows a sort of museum-like environment with objects from the past, which were made with fossil fuels that are now stored in a museum that because they don't exist anymore in the reality that we then live in. So it's a very interesting way to project and position yourself in the future, and then to try to build those worlds which could be more livable and could be more wanted. Another lab, which was a follow-up with the previous lab, which is sound ecologies. And sound ecologies looked through the perspective of sound, how through sound we can understand also a changing landscape. And here we researched the Borselen nuclear facility, which is very interestingly situated next to the biggest Dutch wind park, which you can see also on the right, and one of the most intense waterways, industrial waterways in the Netherlands. So this place literally vibrates in every particle of its space. And also, of course, it's very interesting that all these different types of energy come by, and they have all different promises to the future, which can be debated very much in what kind of future do we want? Do we want a nuclear energy future, or do we want a wind energy future, or do we want a fossil fuel energy future? So this place brings together all these different types of energy problems and discussions. And it's very interesting there with artists to walk around and to explore these spaces through sound, because all these places emit vibrations. And I'm going to play a short clip on our recent lab.
Ecologies of the unseen, and in relation to perspectives, I think every person, when they enter a place, whatever that place is, already offers a different perspective. So the program is designed to find attunement to those unheard voices.
Imagine roots growing from your feet deep into the earth.
The deep listening session makes you very aware of the sounds that are present in your surroundings. And for me, the realization was that most of those sounds are human-made. And it means that the sonic landscape is very much mechanical and very monotonous almost.
We hear the wind racing past the curve of our ear, but there's quiet, and you hear the sounds of the grass with these small ticking, prickling sounds. It's really beautiful.
Sound has this potential, especially with modern technologies, to actually accelerate or decelerate this notion of time. Conception of time can transcend somehow to time that go beyond structures that is given to us.
This place where we went to, which is Borselen in Zeeland, is this immense technocratic landscape where all these different entities come together.
So, and finally, I would like to present what we're currently working on, which opens the day after the great conference, which is our Fiber Festival exploring the theme of mutation. And for us, mutation is a very interesting concept because it would give us the opportunity to rethink and mutate certain structures that we work in or live in. So mutation is, from the space of science, the genetic and alteration of cells, which produce completely sort of new features to animals or humans. But there are also, of course, we have been very much fighting mutating viruses at the moment in the rest of the world. But when we take mutation as a way of thinking, it could propose us new strategies or new ways of how to change ourselves and how to adapt to our changing world. So for instance, one of the works we present also from Xander van der Eyck is a beautiful piece about cold water coral reefs in the North Sea and how they are constantly able to change under very immense anthropogenic pressure due to industry, due to a changing landscape, due to pollution. But they find ways to constantly change and adapt and to live on. And it's very fascinating to see this work and to stand in this work, which is made with the few images that they are from these underwater cold water reefs, and then made into scans and made into immersive environments, because they're rarely researched. Here you can see also the beautiful scans. Or a project that we're currently exploring and presenting is a meditation where you can become a plant and you learn how to sort of think and live like a plant, and how the plant uses its network and its environment to work with other plants and other organisms around it. And the work Metamorphosis from the Institute of Queer Ecologies, which propose queer strategies to think about nature, is that nature is fluid and also adaptable. So maybe we should organize our environment also more fluidly and think about ways of how to change our own sort of identities along with our changing environment. So I want to thank you for the time together, and I hope this presentation gives you a lot of inspiration and insights in a different way of how we can reposition ourselves or rethink the concept of nature into a broader and more entangled and more connected way than we are currently doing often now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So far we have had the 3 presentations. Now, we are going to have discussions with the presenters.
Let me be honest with you. The environment here is not really perfect for communication. We have about 20 audience here, and I do not know how many people are logged on. And some of the people are watching this on YouTube. We have 3 cameras shooting us, and there are so many lightings and very intense. So I cannot even properly watch and read what's on the prompter. And Ms. Katie Mitchell and Mr. Jarl Schulp, their presentations were pre-recorded a few days ago to present today at this setting. And Mr. Jarl Schulp is joining us online. But as for Katie Mitchell, she is doing in her rehearsal for the next production, so she could not make it today. So she could not join us for the discussion live. And as for Jarl Schulp, he will join us for discussion. So there are over a dozen computers, so this is very high tech, I can tell you for sure. This is how we can remain in communication with the audience as well as the speakers and the discussant. Seoul Book Fair completed 2 days ago. So if this takes place in an overseas country, then I would not be able to join this. And Jarl Schiff, I believe you have a festival to start tomorrow. So if this is offline, you would not be able to join us. But thanks to this digital technology, we can have this conference, but I really want to see all the persons in person. But anyway, the setting is totally different, and we have such a limited time. And we have only 20 minutes or so for the discussion. That is why we cannot address many questions from the floor. Excuse me. We shared the questions with Ms. Katie Mitchell, and she kindly shared her responses via video. So let us turn to the first, and I'd like to turn to our 2 speakers for the further discussion. So the first question I shared with her is about her work, one of her works. In order to make this discussion quite interesting, I asked her very simple and straightforward questions, but for the two speakers who are joining us real time, I will ask very controversial questions to make this very live and interesting. So please prepare yourself. So the first question to Katie Mitchell is that a post-anthropocentric perspective is important in discussing climate change. And post-humanistic perspective is very important, but theater is too anthropocentric. So Cherry Orchid, she mentioned toward the end, offers a new perspective. And then how can a theater be combined with post-anthropocentrism and post-humanism? And how can the subject on the stage be extended to include non-humans? That was my first question.
I think your question is such an important question. And such a profound question, and one that challenges the heart of the existing way of making theatre. So after all my 11 years of exploring the subject, of course, it's inevitable that I'm going to arrive at wanting to represent the more than human world and to put on the side human beings. But the question is the more than human world representable on stage? And by representing it, will it be anti-theatrical and boring? So I set myself an impossible challenge, which is to make watching trees theatrical. So in this production, we've actually put the human beings and the characters right in the background, and we're going to try and foreground the trees. And that means that we will be putting what happens to the trees at the center. So for example, in Act 1, it's spring in the orchard. And this means that we'll be very interested in bees. So we're going to put the human drama, barely going to hear little tiny fragments of it, and we're going to have the big event of an enormous bee going into a flower to pollinate the flower. But maybe it's not going to be possible to make it interesting, but we're going to try. And it is the connection between human beings and the more than human world that has gone wrong. So theatre is going to have to look at it. So I'm going to try the experiment now, but I don't know that it will work. But I think it's really important.
Quite an interesting answer. If she would have been here, then I would have asked her a follow-up question. Let me move on to the second question. This is the second question. She recently worked on sustainable theatre at the Beatty Theatre in Switzerland. After creating the production, when she left the work in the hands of the local directors and let the tour proceed, is there anything she has to give up on her work as a director, or is there anything she look forward to, and whether she had any kind of expectations?
Well, already in the actual performance, because we were only going to use 150 watts of electricity, I had to give up a lot of artistic choices. So before the touring already, I had to relinquish a lot of range of choices. But of course, by passing the rules to the local director, they are free and I let go of my artistic ideas. But the thing that is so profound about it is, of course, I have to let go of my ideas and someone else can make something. But now I'm having a very different type of relationship with all these local directors. So we are talking about their ideas for how they're going to interpret it. They're talking about my ideas and we're having a conversation. And so it's not just that I'm giving up something, I'm getting something, which is more important. So I'm getting new relationships, new conversations, new ideas from the new local directors, and a bigger conversation is beginning to happen. So normally I make something, it then tours, I'm in control of it. So that's one way of being in the world. But this is a new way of being in the world. I start something, it's like a relay race, and then I pass the baton to a new runner. And she or he or they create something else, and we have a conversation about it. And so the whole thinking about the intersection between ecology and theatre is like a tree, just lots of new branches, and it's growing across lots of different countries in a new way of making theatre that encourages a deeper conversation. So I think I'm getting more than I'm giving up. And that is really, really exciting.
Because of the friction, there is such a great creative effect. The third question has been already covered. She has made a great effort to reduce the carbon footprint in creative process, and if she considers the carbon footprint in an artist's work, there will be several limitations, and from a director's point of view, there must be things that she has to give up on, such as fancy sets and costumes. So I asked her what she was giving up on, or whether she would gain something new through a change in the creative approach.
The thing is, I think it's probably not useful. I think it's not useful to think about giving things up. I think it's just useful to think about having new parameters to be creative inside. So, of course, whilst I'm doing this work with these new parameters, I'm still making really big shows which have carbon footprints which are awful. So I'm not all my work is inside these parameters. And I really don't want, I think the thing that's worrying about the idea of giving up is what it means to the younger generation. So I don't want to establish a way of thinking which says, well, my generation, we had everything, we had lots of carbon footprint, but because of the environmental catastrophe, the younger generation, you have to give up everything. That feels wrong. So I think it's not useful to approach it as about giving up. I think it's just useful that everyone has to be thoughtful about it. And maybe the offers that people make can be on a spectrum of offers, from very extreme offers like only 150 watts, the whole show off grid, through to, at the other end of the spectrum, milder offers. So it may be that the costume materials are recycled. All that matters is that everyone making theatre is engaging in the conversation and is offering what they are able to offer. So that's the thing that's important. I don't think we need to suddenly go to zero. I think we just need to begin the conversation and invite everyone to make their best offer. However small it is, it doesn't matter. It's about making your offers, and it's not about subtraction, reduction, letting go, unless you're happy to. And of course, I'm a senior artist, so for me, I can let go of stuff, you know? I've had a wonderful career, but I don't want to visit that on the younger generation. Does that make sense? So I think it's about a spectrum of responses and the beginning of the conversation. We need to begin to have the conversation about our art form, which is problematic because it's taking place in buildings with no windows, using a lot of electricity, and it wastes a lot. So we all need to join that conversation.
Well, thank you very much for your answer. Then let us start our live discussion with Dr. Lee and Mr. Jarl Schulp. So two of you are joining me, one in person and the other via Zoom. We have 12 minutes to go. So I'll be quite simple and straightforward in my questions. I will ask you only a couple of questions due to time constraints. In your presentation, Dr. Lee, as a philosopher of science, you looked at the new existence that we will face in the future, especially the issue of artificial intelligence from various perspectives, including that of the post-human. But things I have picked up here and there, many people are interested in looking at human work and achievements from a new perspective, different from a human-centric way of thinking in relation to non-human things. But I think, well, this is as if at one time, similar to the strategies and approaches taken by the West in order to break free from the Western-centric perspective. And you briefly mentioned that in your presentation, but I'd like to know why humans are trying to talk about post-humanism, which deviates from humans in the first place. I do not think everything will be made possible in the absence of human beings. I think that's quite natural for us to think about it. The situation urged us to think that way. Human-centric, anthropocentric way has worked till the 20th century, and we have made great achievements. And based on various indicators, we have various issues at hand, but on average, the quality of life has improved consistently and continuously. But the thing is that it's not sustainable. Now we have come to confront it. Environmental degradation is very serious. It breaks my heart because the environment is degraded. But let me be honest with you, even with the extinction of human beings, the environment will last. The lifestyle of human beings is not sustainable at all, then the humanity itself will face serious challenges and catastrophes. Unless we change the interaction, the way we interact with non-humans, moving away from our view on non-humans as economic resources, and then do not hesitate to use them up, then things will go worse. Post-humanism is not an ideological approach or philosophical trend, but this recognizes that many things in human life are affected to a great extent by non-humans. So post-humanism, in that sense, does not assume the absence of human beings. And with the presence of human beings, post-humanism urges us to view the new way of interaction between humans and non-humans. But toward the end of your presentation, you talked quite extensively about artificial intelligence. Although AI seems to exceed the human capability, it makes incomprehensible failures, and it does not have bodies as an actuator. But for humans and AI, if they are going to work together, what's going to happen? Would you please take an example? Many people say that the time of AI, in the day of AI, humans should do what AI cannot do. But it's rather complex to identify such an area. The areas where AI is not really good at, that is the design of AI. The engineers of AI are quite limited in number. Only top-class engineers can do the job. And the things AI cannot do, believe it or not, is not some technical areas like tax or legal issues, but do things by itself, like cleaning up the house. Atypical work is not something AI can do, where there is no optimal functions. And these things are actually manual works. most of the cases. So the way we interact with AIs, if you say that humans will do what AI cannot do, if you look at and consider the labor market, it's a very dangerous approach. Rather than that, as we can see in the case of the next Rembrandt, we should make the most of AI. And as for ethical issues and the social issues posed by AI, humans should find a sustainable solution by creating social systems and structure. I think that that's how we can work with and live with AIs. In the field of art, I think we can apply this so that we can make the most of AI in the fields of art.
Now my question goes to Director Jarl Schulp. So, Mr. Jarl Schulp, you delved into the relationship between technology and ecology and produced artistic programs in several labs, and I was amazed that many of your pursuits were not just grand in rhetorics and discussion, but you actually produced the wonderful artistic outcomes. And many of your works, I think, turn the science that go beyond common sense to artistic projects that amplify the resonance and impact with the artistic imagination. So to explain better, let me rely on Professor Lee and talk more about this. That Professor Lee, I cannot believe that the earth revolves of itself. I visited the Colombia, South America earlier, and I took the fast airplane, but it took more than a day. But the Earth moves so fast, but we cannot feel that speed. Why? It's because if there are any person who feels the revolution of the Earth, then you have to go to hospital, because it's very normal that you could not feel the speed of the Earth. Because according to the law of inertia in physics, you cannot feel the movement of the Earth. So the Earth is moving at accelerated speed. However, we are a very small creature, and therefore we cannot feel the speed of the Earth. So scientific truth, like the accelerated movement and how we feel, whether we feel or not. These kind of scientific truth has already been revealed through the experimentation, and we are educated that this is true. That's why we accept that the Earth moves fast, but we cannot really feel that. That's why I think for thousands of years, people believe that the sun revolves around the Earth and the celestial bodies revolve around the Earth, because it's very difficult to recognize the Earth's movement. And in fact, the Giordano Bruno, who claimed the heliocentric Copernican theory, was burned at the stake. But the Mr. Arthur Schultz, you see, that's something that goes beyond the common sense, that's invisible. Through your artistic work, you actually turn them into something visible. But wasn't it difficult to make that happen? That's my question.
Yes, it's sometimes difficult to make it happen, to grasp sort of the research that's being done by a scientist or understand the papers. It also takes time, and it takes time to for people to know each other and to know their environment. So with these works, often there is a complexity which is not given away directly from the moment you start to work with it. And it takes time to create relationships, and it takes time to understand an environment. And I think that's also interesting what Katie Mitchell just said, is that if you change the patterns of your work, then new relationships come in. And through those relationships, you can learn a lot about how you might not start with looking and projecting at an environment, but first to start listening to it and to understand why things are happening. And I think that slowing down and taking more time to create works or to create research is also something we could really use in our daily lives in this fast world, is that this slowing down creates an opportunity to have different conversations and to pose new questions.
Thank you very much for the answer. I actually wanted to come up with some naughty question that the science is very difficult and math is difficult, but and therefore the collaboration between scientists and artists will not be that easy. Even if you're trained in universities, oftentimes science talks about something that's not intuitive or that's pretty different from common sense. But recently, on various stages, a lot of information is now given and provided through live performance. And I was amazed and surprised by your work. And I was also deeply impressed by the quality of your work. But sometimes I feel that we learn too much. So as an artistic director, I think your work would not be that easy. It would be pretty daunting. That's why I came up with this question. Now the next question, one more question before concluding. I understand that the artists are the ones who have the most sensitive tentacles, which means that the artists express our pain and happiness and all kinds of emotion and affection in the most sensitive and accurate way. And artists are the ones who could express these human emotions better and have better interaction with the audience. But when it comes to climate change, how large do you think the cooperation and solidarity should be built among artists? So that will be my last question.
It's an interesting question, and I think that solidarity in that sense is a very important way of working. And as also interesting enough, I'm referring again to the previous presentation, which is sort of creating these new relationships and creating a solidarity. It really comes down to collective work. We're finding ourselves in a moment when we're unable to grasp alone what is happening and unable to fix it alone. And also the blame should not be placed on someone alone of the situation that we find ourselves in. So solidarity and cooperation are kind of the big steps forward, I think, into creating a new art field that is working differently with each other and also thinks differently about ideas of what is an idea, what is ownership, what is how can we decentralize things. And I think those are very important steps that we can take and advocate for coming from the arts, design, and the performance space.
Thank you very much for the answer. Listening to the art show's presentation, I actually wanted to visit Netherlands and have some interaction with you, and I also want to witness how you come up with your work. But I believe that a lot of audiences from the floor, offline as well as online, I actually want to continue with the discussion, but because of the time constraint, we may have to conclude. But one day I'm going to meet you in Netherlands in person, I promise. And now time for conclusion. The ARKO International Symposium titled Rethink, Reimagine and React. So we just had this first session and we still have 3 more sessions to go, and artists will show various creative works that they work on. So please stay tuned. And before the start of the second session, we are going to enjoy the live performance by artist Kim Ji-sun. And in some corners of the globe, still there are people who believe that the earth is flat. And it's very difficult to feel the impact of the climate change. And a lot of artists, despite they are suffering from the COVID pandemic, they work hard to promote the understanding of the climate change. And if the climate change becomes a reality soon, we will face huge calamities simply incomparable to the current COVID crisis. And I sincerely believe that our efforts and all the energies, sound and light that emit from our endeavor will eventually reach and resonate with our audiences to avert the catastrophic ending. And with that, I would like to thank all the speakers for their great insight. And with that, we would like to conclude the first session. Thank you very much.
말하라고요. Hi, welcome back. This is second session of 2022 ARKO International Symposium. It's titled Artist Creative Action. Subtitle, Creative Friction. I'm the moderator, Jong Choi. Previous session talked about the challenges the human race has faced. That is climate change and post-anthropocentrism. I think it was very exciting and enlightening. Now, in this session, we'd like to address the keyword of creative friction. Now, we'll open up dialogue amongst our presenters and artists. We have 5 speakers today, and first, media artist Byung-Jun Kwan, and he is based in Korea. And our second speaker is Nora Omurchu. She is artistic director of Transmediale in Berlin. Third presenter is from Singapore. They are artist and producer of Prolitopia, Spang and Ray. Finally, we have the last speaker, Ton van Gool from Netherlands. He's the director of STRP Festival. Now, thank you for joining us out of your busy time. And we'd like to go on with the presentation successfully. And then afterwards, we'll have some interesting dialogue across the presentations. All right? Please.
Good evening. I am Kwon Byung-jun, a media artist based in Seoul. I studied literature in my undergraduate, and my mom, who was a piano teacher, helped me develop my interest in music. Until my early 30s, I worked as a musician in pop music and even managed an independent record label. Then when I turned 33, I went to Hague to study music. During my stay there, I fell for the sound of writing. I became very interested in the sound of writing. I analyzed the crisp sound created through the contact between a pen and paper and used analysis to derive the shape of characters from the sound. That was my research topic back then. For example, when drawing a horizontal line and a vertical line, the sounds are different. And I trained the computer to distinguish these different sounds. It was back in 2006. And at the time, the AI and machine learning were not widely adopted as today. Therefore, I had to develop all the hardware and software all by myself for my project. And so for the first time in my life, I designed a device based on electronic signal. And as you can see from this photo, this piezo camera pen was my invention at the time. So I installed this piezo on the tip of the pen to convert friction between pen and paper into electronic energy and signal, which then get amplified and transferred to an electronic motor of the camera inside the pen. Then energy from the sound of writing is converted to haptic vibration, and the camera focusing on the tip of the pen has LED on its top, and the vibration is changed to light for that LED. Later, I worked heavily on space sensorial tool for art performance, not for research, and I studied my career as a media artist, and I also worked as a hardware engineer in STIM Amsterdam. Let me share with you one anecdote that I experienced when I was so much into the sound of writing. I was in a train to Germany, and it was very, very silent, and someone was writing on a note. And because the train was completely silent, I was able to hear the sound very clearly, And just by listening to the sound, I was able to distinguish that it was the Korean characters. Under the theme of this creative friction, I would like to tell you from now on how my early sound-based work has evolved and how I communicated with the public. While I focused on performance, I got a chance to participate in exhibition which involved various sound artists. As multiple artists did their performance together in an open space, it was not easy to avoid sound interference. So that was how I came up with the location recognition headset. The headset accurately recognized the coordinates in space and therefore deliver location-specific sound. So if audience wears the headset, they can link what they hear with the space or artwork there, because each sound is mapped with different space. Using this geographic positioning headset, I tried to deliver location-specific sound and came up with the forest of subtle truths and studied my siege work since then. Based on my experience in the Netherlands, where I lived as a sojourner, I'm interested in the voice of foreigners living in Korea and tried to help their voices heard. In 2018, there was a big incident in Korea. It happened on the Jeju Island on the southern tip of Korea. To promote tourism, the island allowed visa-free entry for foreigners, and refugees from Yemen came to Jeju in large groups, and it triggered a huge controversy in Korea that valued pure blood. So I went down to Jeju Island to listen to their voices, and I recorded their songs and stories, and I let them hear through the geographic position headset in an open space outside the museum. And as you can see from these photos, each chair is mapped with the songs of different refugees, and in the surroundings, I play the voices of activists who advocate for them. My initial interest in foreigner or sojourner grew, and I produced the second work, Lullaby of Multicultural Family. Just like other countries, rural villages in Korea experience serious hollowing out of young population. Males remaining in rural area often failed to marry in their youth and could not find their spouses, and so many of them choose for international marriage, and it still continues today. Many young women from Southeast Asia countries such as Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand moved to Korea to get married with old-aged farmers in Korea, and today their children represent a majority of elementary school students in rural areas of Korea. And I started to become curious about what kind of lullabies these foreign young women sing to their babies as they move to rural villages in Korea for marriage. So to record their lullabies, I visited Hongsong, a rural village of Korea. As these young women are not proficient in Korean language, so they sing lullaby in their own mother tongue, and their children have grown listening to such songs and remember them. I recorded the songs of these migrant women and their children, and I used the same location-based headsets to play them in the outer terrace area. It was in the vicinity of the Incheon International Airport, so while watching airplane taking off and landing, the audiences can listen strange lullabies sung by these migrant women and children in their own languages. Let me tell you more about what I can do with this location recognition headset. In my work titled Resonance Village, this headset works completely different from conventional headset. At the Resonance Village, if you wear this headset and approach to someone, that person can hear what you hear via this headset. The headset then mixes the sound of what you hear and what your neighbor hears. So in this work, audiences wear headsets and walk along and encounter one another. And at each encounter, they say hello to each other and sounds are mixed and exchanged. Through the process of approaching one another and listening to neighbors and saying hellos and exchanging greetings, audiences can experience a completely new way of exchanges and communications. So that was my work titled The Resonance Village. Through such sound project that I tried to apply the concept and the sense of space to deliver the voices of aliens and strangers, I realized that Korean society has a gigantic barrier that works exclusively against foreigners. And it provoked me to create a more hypothetical figure, extremely unbearably foreign, and test them out maybe with a bit of shock. Test Koreans. So that was how I started my robot work. These robots in this picture were made by me in 2018. At the time, I was a complete novice in robot, but without any background knowledge, within the short period of 3 months, I anyway managed to design and create this manually built robot. The heads of the robots were made of light, and they shine each other and play shadow tag. They extend their hands to audience, and then audiences become puzzled. They don't know how to react to the robot extending a single arm. And from this process, they reveal what they really think of foreigners or foreign objects. Then, at a certain moment, some are trying to touch their hands, some are trying to shy away from them. Then, at a certain moment, these robots dance together to music, and with grandiose finale, they come to sleep as if what happened before was just a dream. So in year 2018, I started my robot work. To make a robot, I had to work with motor that I was not used at all. And in the process of mastering it, I realized that this process is very similar to when I design and practice a new musical instrument. And currently, I am doing performance with these robot strangers. These robots are not created by engineers, but by musicians. And for control, I use the program that I use for sound programming to control these robots. I understand that, yes, there are much room for improvement, very basic and very shoddy, yet they have strong survivability that they never die even when they fall from the second floor and roll on the ground. Using these robots, I created a mechanical theater show and presented that several times on various stages. And linking it with location recognition headset, I created a show called A Serious Night with Ghost Theater Company. And the show was performed in the traditional house village in Seoul last year. During the show, audiences wear headsets and hold bowl-shaped will-o'-the-wisp, and they walk around traditional house village while listening to the story of a hypothetical ghost narrated by AI. The traditional villages are mapped with 5 different stories, and spectators can choose the story, one of them, which means audiences will hear different stories or different combination of stories. Each space has robot-based artwork, installation, and with various installations that correspond with space and artworks, audiences are led to have very odd experience of a night in the village. So far, I have talked about my journey as an artist that started with the design of space sensorial device using friction between a paper and a pen and shifted to headset and robots. Friction is omnipresent. It's everywhere. And the contact area of friction is always heated with energy. And that energy sometimes gets escalated to conflicts. That's why today we are living in an era of extreme friction manifested in the form of wars, and many are immersed into conflict and fight through game. While rapid technological advancement produced a lot of dropouts, mass media equipped with massive capital now provide entertainment to majority of our society. Taking virtual reality as their weapon, these mass media widen the gap between people and technology and change the society for the worse. What technologies can we rely on to resonate with the world and communicate with your neighbor? I don't buy commercial theory that giant companies or network oligopoly claim. I'm sure there is more to online media than simply subscribing for or watching advertisement for service. Sometimes I feel so saddened by the paradox that I had to watch commercial ad to see the video of brutal war. And in this sense, I would like to continue to explore the possibility of new and creative communication that can genuinely reflect the lives of myself and my neighborhood. And this will conclude my presentation. If you have any questions or further comment, please. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your wonderful journey across different media, different people, different social issue. I guess this very suited to the overall topic of creative action and friction as well. Now, following this theme, our next presentation will be led by Nora Murutu, and she's the artistic director of media art festival known Transennale, based in Berlin. Please.
Hello, my name is Nora Omuraku. I'm an Irish curator and researcher, and my practice explores the tensions between technology, culture, and politics, and how socio-technical systems are imagined, built, and used. I'm currently based in Berlin, where I work as the artistic director for Transmediale Festival. And to give a little bit of background about the festival, it's Germany's premier media art festival. And it's been in operation for nearly 35 years now. And it happens annually at the beginning of February every year. And it's very much concerned with critical reflection on kind of post-digital theory and practice. I took over as artistic director of the festival in 2021. And during this time, we made a year-long edition of the festival that explored the political agency of refusal and its potential to form new socio-political realities. In our thinking about these ideas or this theme of refusal, we were thinking about it as a strategic and generative act, one that opened up possibilities for new imagination and new subjectivities and new understandings of histories. And the idea was to push away from this idea of refusal as something that meant no, or it was something that was passive or acted as an exit. One of the ways in which we explored our understanding of refusal was to think about it through 3 different thematic lenses. And these were friction, scale, and entanglement. And we were trying to, as a curatorial team, build an understanding of different modes of refusal, how they intersected and how they could potentially form an assemblage of collective political responsibilities across different places and across different times. So I wanted to speak to you today about one of these that aligns with the theme of what we're talking about in this panel, friction, and some of the artistic work that emerged from the festival that speak to ideas of friction and how artists engage with it and its connected issues as a subject. Often when we speak about refusal, we think about it, or at least I do anyway, We think about it in terms of political positions and debate and how friction and tension that arise from different political positions create things like conflict, indifference, action, or even disengagement, and hopefully eventually sometimes societal change. When developing the ideas behind the festival, the theme of refusal was in part actually inspired by Irish political action of recent years. Prior to moving to Germany, there were a number of political changes that were voted on publicly in Ireland that came about due to decades of grassroots campaign that sought to overturn and advocate for new legislation regarding things like women's healthcare and LGBTQ plus rights. After many decades of political protest and campaigning in Ireland, these issues were voted on publicly in 2 Irish referendums, and they passed. And I became interested in kind of these ideas of political friction that occurred, and I witnessed people who were campaigning on either side of these kind of polemic kind of issues. And I was interested to see how both sides engage with accounts of friction and refusal and use them to kind of advocate for their different kind of political positions. So one of the things that I wanted to investigate within the festival was how refusal and its capacity for friction often created practices and values that were sometimes polarizing to each other. But instead of like ignoring these individual or collective forms of friction, I wanted to work with artists whose practice tried to engage differently with different accounts of friction that they encountered and engage directly as a political subject. So during this year-long edition of the festival, we developed a new platform called the Almanac for Refusal, where every month on the full moon, we publish a small collection of contributions that engage with the festival's theme through artistic and theoretical positions. So I want to actually speak about 2 of these contributions and the ways in which they engage with different ideas of friction, from contemporary political struggles and protest to philosophical ideas that embed themselves inside social hierarchies. The first is finalforest.exe by Sahid Rahal. He's an Indian artist and filmmaker whose work includes painting and sculpture and performance and moving images. And a lot of his work, he's experimenting with artificial intelligence simulations inside of video game engines to build personal cosmos of like different imaginary creatures, and using storytelling and myth as a way to kind of like to speak to kind of grand narratives that are embedded within society.
Tell me, my friend, can what comes next transcend the present? We are witnessing the return of natural history. Biology has once again taken center stage. We struggle to stitch back our lives under the shadow of a global pandemic, while typhoons and hurricanes are becoming as commonplace as the afternoon rain. On the other hand, the nation-state has become a site of collapsing time. The past is lurking back into the present. We are marching headlong into a majoritarian state that is based on a half-baked idea of civilizational purity. The state has enacted the abduction of myth itself. It spreads false archaeological propaganda. It promises the resurrection of absentee temples. It feeds us empty ideals through social media gurus. Beneath this stupor of distraction, the tentacles of state bureaucracy slither out to revoke fundamental rights from minorities and silence all forms of dissent through police action.
In finalforest.exe, we find ourselves in an unfolding cybernetic ritual. A masked figure, a keeper of ancient secrets and lost histories, is having a conversation with a sentient AI program. He is whispering kind of remnants of kind of these lost past and lost histories to an AI bipedal. And this creature wanders around a seemingly infinite tropical forest. This creature that Rahal Sahid created is not driven by a single brain, but rather a congregation of multiple AI scripts that are attached to the virtual bones within its polygon body. And in this work, he's mixing folklore, urban legends, archaeological records, conspiracies, and science fiction to interrogate the mythical narratives that preserves caste as the core anatomy of Indian society. And his idea behind his work is to speculate how we can move past the frictions that these relations create into a type of better future.
A secret rule that holds true in the shadow movements of both spycraft and subatomic particles. The more one knows of your position, the lesser is known of your movement, with the inverse also being true. The uncertainty principle is a game of bait and switch played on the ethereal edge of reality. On other nights, the celestial chaos of the universe takes the shape of the Boltzmann brain, a mind that imagines itself into existence and, by extension, imagines the entire universe. It then imagines itself as an intelligent observer within this complex conjuration, complete with a fictional backstory rife with memories and desire, all held together on mere chance. Every once in a while, the winning hand is held in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, proposed by Henry Everett II. Incidentally, this interpretation of the world at large holds within itself all the other hands that have been both won and lost simultaneously and in superimposed timelines. In the year 1957, Henry wagered that the ultimate shape of reality is one that seekers of ancient artifacts, lovers, and revolutionaries have known all too well. The universe is the shape of all possibilities. Nothing is ever lost.
Secondly, I wanted to talk about the work of Bassem Saad. Last year, he was an artist in residence with us at Transmediale, and during this residency, he created an experimental documentary that examined the relationship between protest, crisis, humanitarian aid, migrant labor, and Palestinian outsider status in Lebanon. The film was commissioned by Transmediale just after the Beirut port explosion, and it tells a story about different forms of political protest, the late Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter revolts of 2020, and the story of the Beirut port explosion.
بروح بسأل الناس إنه شفت هيك مني شو معناتها؟ بيقولوا لي إنه بدك تطلعي من البلد. أوكي. فعلا أوكي جيت على لبنان. بس حلم ذاته لحل عم بحلم. نفس الحلم. نفس المشهد. نفس الشيء. ما بعرف ليش.
The juxtaposition of these events bring to light different ideas of contention and collectivity. In this work, he locates crucial pressure points affecting the flow of solidarity that can happen in relation to one another, and how different ideas of societal friction can be contested and challenged. He is reflecting on the capacity of technology to scale up different accounts of protests from across the world, and he comments on how we can show solidarity from different communities and different geographies through technology itself. So I think it's very useful to look at how both of these artists are thinking about friction in different ways. Here, instead of, in both of their work, instead of focusing in on indifference and focusing in on kind of the types of uncertainty that friction brings about, they are engaging with these ideas of friction itself, and they're engaging directly with the societal issues that the friction is directly connected to. And their aim really here is to interrupt that standstill that friction often brings about. They want to mobilize thoughts, they want to mobilize ideas, they want to share different types of actions that allow us to gain insights to the ways that the obstructions that friction can kind of bring about in our everyday lives.
Thank you, Nora, for the fascinating presentation. It appears that you're taking a very unique take on the notion of friction and reconstruct it along the notion of refusal and rejection with the presentation of two artists' work. I think it's very well suited to the topic that we are addressing. Next presentation will be made from Sprang and Ray. They are from Singapore, who are artist and producer of this group known Pluritopia. And I expect this will be enriching our ongoing discussion. So please take it over.
Hello everyone. Hi. Thanks for having us. We're Sprang and Lei, and I'm Sprang.
And I'm Lei.
Yep. So thanks so much for inviting us to just have a chit chat and everything. Yep. So when we first had the privilege of saying that hey, we'll be involved in this symposium, this dialogue. We're given a brief, and the theme is creative friction. So we got us thinking, what are the kinds of friction in our work that we are actually having encounter. We always encounter these parts of on our work, and we actually went back to a very strong direction that we are actually keep going into, which is human becoming landscape. So for creative friction, right, we kind of have three theoretical underpinnings, conceptualizations, which is comfortable dissonance, self-forgetting mirroring, and then circuitry. Obviously, most of our works, we acknowledge that we do gather a lot of data from our participating audiences. We do modify their bodies, and in the sense of we use their bodies to perform certain actions, obviously, and we do interrupt their behaviors to create a sense of curiousness. Yeah. So the first one is comfortable dissonance.
Yeah, so comfortable dissonance is a project called Sensing Goodman, and then the whole point of here is playing on the uncomfortableness of being with another person. It's actually a response to what happened during the circuit breaker in Singapore in 2021. And then the whole point is going everywhere, things are demarcated, you have tapes, you have barricades, and then you have to constantly do this gesture of scanning your temperature with your hand, and given the task that we have to create like a sound installation. So we thought it would be interesting if we can sort of take that particular gesture and translate it into something that is more sonified, that is more like a sound installation. In this case, what we are trying to question is the what constitutes a good person, because when you're scanning your temperature, it tells you beep, you can enter the space. It creates a perception that you are healthy enough or well enough to enter a space. But is that really true, or is it an illusion of what is a good person, a healthy person?
I think, as you saw in the previous slides, the idea, the form itself takes place that it's a direct, reaction to the kind of space that we were living at that time. Society was in it. I know Korea did not go through a full, circuit breaker, but for us, when we did, it was kind of surreal, like a dystopia, exactly barricaded on where you can go, how you can go to the place you go, who can be beside you, and how do you make sure that you are a good enough person to enter the space to be with other people.
I think the creative friction comes here is actually the conflicting sort of conflicting thought or conflicting notion of what makes a good place. So imagine you beep, you scan your temperature, so you're well enough to enter a space, but the moment as more and more people enter the space, it becomes a little bit unnerving, it becomes a little bit more dangerous. Then does it still constitute a good space?
So we responded to it by having the sound change, the kind of just a basic coding that we were able to get the whole sound area, soundscape to change and to respond to the kind of the number of people there, because we were also gathering environmental data on the CO2, PM 2.5, and the kind of temperature that you have when you scan in. It kind of affects that sound, the frequency and the timbre as well. So for that, I think partaking in that being with each other in the same space, then if that's the case, you create that kind of dangerous or unpleasant sound that came about during the whole installation. Yeah, so the next one that we were, one of the other works that we curated was the self-forgetting mirror, and it's very straightforward. It's actually a collective portraiture that we had using projections, hidden in under lenses and water and all that kind of thing. And the idea that when you look upon or gaze upon a reflection, you would expect to see yourself.
Exactly.
The selfie and everything.
But in this case, you don't see yourself. No. In this case, you see potentially maybe streams of text or poetry, but in this case, if there happens to be someone else on the other video sculpture that is connected remotely, you see a stranger. So it's a reflection that don't reflect you. It makes you sort of there's this kind of dissonance with regards to how things are supposed to behave. So this is what we're really interested in, always constantly trying to subvert how object responds to or changes behavior.
Yeah, so with the friction part comes upon the fact that most visitors to this sculpture would expect to see themselves being reflected, but because it's a two-part sculpture located at two different sides of the same building, you only get to trigger the projection, the response, the whole sculpture if two people are there at the same time, gazing upon the reflection, and the reaction always starts with fear.
And the friction comes in for that particular individual, albeit it's not really visible outwardly, but it's actually playing on the idea of surveillance and voyeurism, because you thought you're like looking at someone and watching someone, but actually you're being surveilled, you're being watched. So it plays on this kind of uncomfortable in between friction of watched and being watched. So moving on to our third project, it's called Self-Secreted Self.
Actually, it is the theoretical underpinning. As you can see, we're getting closer and closer to our direction of humans becoming landscape. And this artwork is called A Space for Digital and Human. And because it's a lab, it's a sandbox lab. This is actually still a work in progress.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we actually were able to get our hands onto OpenBCI kits to
bring computer interface.
BCI kits, which is bring computer interface, and we were able to hook me up mostly. Usually, Lei is usually behind the screen doing her own coding and all that, trying to tap into the brainwave and how specific states, mental, emotional states, can directly affect the artwork that you see behind the person.
But maybe I could play a short video of what this whole project is about.
Yeah.
But in fact, our initial kind of like intention was to have two strangers wear the headsets and then using their brainwave as the main mode of communication, whereby it's a wordless, a gestureless, purely non-visible way of communication using your brainwaves. And this is still at the very kind of like infancy stage in our exploration.
Yeah.
But I think the most difficult part, the friction, comes in when how do you know that I'm thinking about the same thing as you? Or how does one brainwave pattern translate to similar thought? What if I give you, say, for example, a team apple? And how does it translate to a same kind of brainwave pattern? So I think it's a lot of kind of like a decoding and coding and uncoding different patterns.
I think most artists like to talk about, this was commissioned, it was successful, blah blah blah. But this was a, I wouldn't say it's a failure. I would say that it is a project that brought us back to our roots, which is the we needed to find a common language. Due to the time period, we were unable to find a common language. As you would say, is my state of hyper focus. Would you know that what I'm thinking gives me the state of hyper focus? And what are then these thoughts? You would know my state, but you wouldn't know my thoughts, right? So we have to find that common language, and then it goes back to really basic art project, which is encoding, decoding, a language. And right now we are in the process of doing that, because ultimately this project is scalable, where we want to have many people talking to many other people hooked up to brainwaves and collaboratively produce a collective artwork using brainwaves. So going closer to the theme of human becoming landscapes, we always think of how then can our artwork be closer to that. And sometimes the way that we do it might not be an artwork, but it might be organizing art events and curating things. That might be also one of our ways. And one of our latest project would be Puritopia. Puritopia means many utopias, and this is in collaboration with Korea's ARKO. Puritopia is actually in a nutshell a very apt platform using being in the metaverse and creating different artist studios for collaboration.
And the whole thing here, while we were producing and in conversations with the Korean curators, is this idea of inefficient bodies versus efficient bodies. And then how are we going to terraform the practice in this landscape? What kind of environment would suit us? And now that you have the human bodies in space, then now you have the human bodies that can be remade, reassembled, remanicured, jacked up, which is through cyborgs or cybernetics. We were talking about Stalag, and then how you can sort of add on apparatus to your body and augment your body. And definitely moving towards the whole idea of a collective circuited self. What would happen if this circuited self, collective circuited self, is in sync, or even out of sync, at conflict? What is the makeup of it? And then definitely looking at the metaverse, is it a replica of the real world? These are questions that we were constantly asking. And then
I think the idea of friction is a good word to bring up now. one of the things that really jumped at us at the brief, the theme was frictionless friction. And while we are always thinking about the convenience that we can have, which is becoming, frictionless, the ease of getting into the metaverse, the ease of just, connecting with someone, whatever that word means, right?
It's actually not that easy.
It actually brings up a lot of issues.
Yeah.
And actually the issues are the differences between people, cultures, types are becoming more apparent, and then these differences causes friction. And we see on a national scale of different nations, but yet we see on a global scale, where the friction is difficult to hide now, and people are more willing to engage in friction, while all the same time maintaining a kind of a good network and facade of frictionless ease and convenience. And then when they ask about, so where do you think the art direction can be going, and all that kind of thing, and the two of us, we were like, how to think about these kind of questions even in our own artwork, the direction that we are going.
Yeah, I think back to the point of creative friction and back to the point of humans becoming landscape, we are not just interested in the human bodies as we see as flesh, but in this case now with the metaverse, you can see in the next video over here, we have the artists in the artist studio. This is our first virtual tour. They come in as avatars, and then it's a representation of what the artists choose to depict their artistic, I would say, persona in this case. And how would this manifest in the metaverse, and does the behavior in the metaverse impact them as individual artists? Will certain behavior be inherited from the artist's real world, or will certain behavior be only present in the metaverse?
Yeah. So with that in mind, we would like to say that although we do not have the certain direction, the concrete direction that we are going to take, where it comes to our practices and all that, but what we can be certain is maybe the role of the artist and the landscape that we are in actually is better than before, because with friction there will be issues, and with issues there will be grayness in the landscape, and that's where we exist to suss out these nuances.
Okay.
Thank
With
you.
this, we end our presentation. Thank you,
you,
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Spang and Ray. It was a very playful take on the question of the cutting-edge technology and its role and its relationship to human idea and human body as well. But I guess I would like to have some more clarification and articulation on the notion of human as landscape if we have time later. Okay, let's move on to our final panelist, Tom van Gool. Again, he is the director of Netherlands STRP Festival. And this festival brings together a variety of different groups and people, including artists, philosopher, designer, and just citizens, to talk about the contingent possibilities of the future and the new landscape that technology may open up. So take it over, Tom.
Hello, my name is Tom van Gool. I am director of Stripe Festival, and we are based in Eindhoven, the Netherlands. And you might know Eindhoven because it's the capital of Philips, the electronic company. And we have set up this festival in 2006 because we missed a festival or a bigger event, which made the relation between creativity and technology. So our mission is to set up an open dialogue with the public, artists, designers, media makers, and thinkers about the relationship between people, technology, society, and the future. So we are organizing a yearly festival in the inner city in Eindhoven, and one of the main parts of the festival is an exhibition. It is an exhibition with 14 works, and most of the works are commissioned by us. So we ask artists to make a new work based on the theme that we have every year, and based on new technologies that they can explore. So in the festival, you will be having works that use VR, that use AR, that also use sensors, and we prefer works that are interactive. We'd love it when people are participating in an artwork and not just consuming it. And these works are spread around town, so you have a kind of a route that you make amongst 13 galleries, and in that way you can see the entire exhibition. Another very important part of Stripe Festival is education. Like every year we have between 10 and 15,000 students who visit Stripe, and it's very important that they learn about technology, that they learn about the impact of technology, that they play with technology, and that they can explore the creativity that they have while using technology. There's another, like a very special project that we do with education. It's called Space Makers. And that means that a group of students works together very intensively for like 3 months, and then they make a presentation of their research that they've been doing. They are in total control of their entire Space Makers period. They think of the work, how they want to make it, how they want to present it, and in which direction it goes, and they are kind of guided by a professional artist. Another thing which is truly important for us is the dialogue, as we said in our mission. I think it's very important that we all talk about technology, about the impact of technology, and about how technology influences our lives. So we have a series of artists and speakers and thinkers who reflect on the theme that we have chosen for a certain year. And it's always very inspiring. And the thing we are very good at, I think, is to explore new types of formats for having this dialogue and having these conversations. I mean, the traditional format is like a presentation, a keynote, and a Q&A. But we love to play with the format. So we had experimental dialogue sessions in an entirely dark room where people couldn't see each other, and which made them, talk about their feelings more openly. We also did an experiment with Korean artist Ayung Kim, and she was using VR chat to present her work and also have the dialogue in VR chat. So dialogue, exchanging ideas for possible future scenarios is truly important for us, and we love to play with these formats. Then we have an extensive music program, and of course there are DJs, there are people who fool around with electronic equipment, with synthesizers, with performances, with sensors. There's people doing poetry and music, and sometimes we commission a new experiment, like if some musician wants to explore how it is to work with dancers, we give them an opportunity to work on this piece for a certain time and then present it at the Stripe Festival. So this music part of Stripe Festival is very experimental, it's very open, and we'd love to present new names and new works amongst better well-known artists. As I said earlier, we are working with a yearly theme. For 2020, we chose the theme Scenarios for the Post-Anthropocene. And the question was, try to imagine a world in which the human people, are not present anymore for whatever reason. Try to imagine a world where there's plants, stones and rocks and water and fungi how would this world without humans, how would that organize itself? How would that behave? It was very daring and inspiring to think about a world without human beings. And for example, French artist Antoine Bertin, he made a new artwork in which he compared the DNA of plants and of people. Through a sonification of the DNA, we were able to compare the DNA of plants and humans, and the entire finding was that the DNA of plants and humans isn't that different as we might think. So this suited very much in this post-Anthropocene theme. Then in 2021, we were asking artists and ourselves, could you think of new ways of collectivity? Because we are living in a hyper-individual world, and there's so much people who are kind of lost. People are lonesome, people are lonely. How could we create new ways to form collectives? What could be the new collectives? And Jong, he's one of the artists that participated. He came up with a performance, which was actually a choreography, and the dancers in the choreography are trying to mislead the surveillance cameras that are everywhere in public space. So they were making like new movements to fool the software of trying to detect people and trying to get control of behavior of people. Then 2022, last year, our theme was the end of infinity, and we were wondering how we should find new meanings of infinity and affinity, because we were, like always used to that the Earth would exist forever and ever and ever, which might not be true. So we have to think about the fact that the Earth and the world might be ending at some point. We must be aware of that. And at the same time, we are playing with the length of our lives. We don't accept death anymore. So we are, thinking about transhumans, about post-humans, and how does that lead to a new experience or the new definition of infinity? And we will be showing an after movie of Stripe 2022, in which you see all the elements that I just mentioned. Like you see the exhibition, you see the music performances, you see the education, you see new works, and of course you see the audience being part of Stripe Festival. Then for 2023, for next year, the theme is the art of listening. We all know that we have the tendency of shouting too much about, like wanting to say what we think. But we unlearned to listen to each other. We unlearned to listen to other cultures, to other people. And we are not very good in listening to ourselves, to our intuition, and we are not very good in listening to the earth and to plants and to animals. So we are composing this festival right now, and one of the artists that we invited to participate is Hakim Adam, and he's making a new installation which is based on the singing tradition and the messages that are in the singing of people who live in Africa, in Ghana. So please join us for Stripe Festival, which will be in Eindhoven, April 13 to 16, 2023. You all are very welcome.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your engaging presentation. It's a marvelous caricaturing of the festival that you have been organizing. And looks like it's a challenge to the classical notion of festival per se. And you try to sort of reinterpret it along the notion of the idea and philosophy and the concept as such. Very exciting. All presentations done now, and it's time to have some conversation across our panelists. Let me loosen up a little bit. I mean, there are multiple screens going on and lightings and very bombarding my senses, but let me focus on the our own conversation. Do you have any keyword pop up in your mind when you listen to other presentation that cuts across 4 different notions, initiatives, and actions taking place in different places? Can you identify one word that you would like to have our conversation clustering around. Oh, you're all saying that that's my job, right? Of course, okay. How about crossing? When I listen to your own presentation, there are many crossings taking place. Crossings across genre, crossings across convention, borders, and people, objects. And of course, these are all concerned with the notion of friction. Friction, we come across friction when two or multiple subjects and objects are gathered together. It could be positive or destructive, right? The friction could be translated into heat. But before this friction arises, I guess there is some basic initiative action of crossing something. Connectivity. So, along with the idea of crossing, can you say a few words about your work and your impression on other initiatives done by our colleagues? Do you want me to point someone? Spang and Ray, you go. Yeah.
Okay, you go. Sure. So maybe rather than crossing, Bong, we would use. I mean, for me, Spang and Lay exists in the interstices, the small gaps that are available, as with many of our fellow community artists. And I think obviously there are certain crossings, as you would call it, but every once in a while we will meet, and we it's not as if it is purposeful or not purposeful. It's just the climate, and sometimes the trend, the movement goes a certain direction, and therefore, like now, obviously, Spang and Lay is also looking into obviously, other than the metaverse, is also the Anthropocene, the hyper objects, and humans becoming landscape, humans being post-human. So these are the kinds of crossing that I guess even among ourselves, we perhaps could have certain touch points. And I guess this is just, it also affirms the fact that the few of us, we are very much into what the general society, the world is concerned about. And I think that is very heartening to know that in spite of cultural differences and all that, there are certain global issues that are confronting us, and how we respond together as a, as individuals, but as a group, as an industry.
Sounds great. Excellent.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, Ton.
Yeah, I think more than ever so, there isn't such thing as that art could be isolated. There's no such thing as that philosophy could be just a way of thinking for people at the university. There's no such thing that like popular culture would be isolated and things like that. So I think this is a very interesting period that we're living in, because everything crosses over with everything. So there is no separated domains for knowledge, for art, for science, and I think we all getting like real rich results of all these crossings, and I think we're fastly learning from each other, from all the domains, and how people are thinking, how people are behaving. And I think it's very interesting to to be right in time on this moment to have an exhibition or have a conference like this, to put a finger on the time of where we are right now, because I think we just started with crossing. I think it could go further and further until there is no such thing as your own domain or your own self or your own little bubble.
Okay, but Well, I guess there are some free agents that could move around different domains and different border of countries. And convergence, yes, big convergence across different fields, let's say technology and humans and money and culture and all that thing. But at the same time, shouldn't we think about the gatekeepers? When we cross something, there are always resistance. Gatekeepers, barricades, barriers, if it's language and money, state, censorship, so many things. There are many resistance to it, isn't it? So on that note, Nora, can you say, can you readdress the issue of rejection in conjunction with these barriers and barricades?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess when we were investigating refusal, we were thinking about it in lots of different kind of ways and thinking about it as having a type of kind of materiality and friction being kind of one of those things. And I also just wanted to pick up a little bit on just what you said as well, just the idea of like crossing. Because for me as well, I would say that it's not even just crossing, it just shows how entangled we are with one another, not just in terms of like our political positions, but also kind of like how our financial systems are entangled with each other, our systems of transport like cross over and relate to one another. Like I remember just thinking about this in relation to when the COVID-19 vaccine was first discovered and it was first announced, and then how like the stock prices of Zoom actually fell as a result of like the vaccine price. So I always think about these different types of entanglements. Some of them are financial, others are like more political and relate to kind of like political struggles, for example. I always think about kind of like the different types of histories that we have with one another, and how like different political struggles are often kind of correlate or correspond or share different forms of empathy with each other then as well. But in terms of kind of refusal and friction, I think that like refusal and friction have always kind of existed in conjunction with one another, and friction has always been a huge part of society, huge part of kind of like how we progress and how we speak to each other. And I think that I guess that with technology or kind of like social media platforms, we kind of begin to see kind of more and more of that friction kind of existing. And I would think that that's kind of one of the key things that we noticed, especially that's something that we wanted to speak about in the festival last year, was this idea of that kind of like the visibility of friction, the scale of friction that we kind of like experience or see is not it's something that kind of exists like individually or in local senses, but then it kind of scales across different types of platforms and infrastructures and social media to create different types of kind of more collective, global, national forms of friction then as well. So we were interested in kind of like how friction is not something to be scared of, as something that be negotiated around. It's also something that like that we thought as a curatorial team that is something that it shouldn't exist as a standing point, but rather is something that it should always be kind of contested or like engaged with. And that was one of the key things that we wanted to kind of bring to light with this investigation between refusal and friction, that we wanted to create a way of thinking that they were like interconnected, they were entangled with each other, and that they pointed to different types of possibility. And that was what we were really trying to maybe unpack a little bit through different artistic work, through different essays and things like that as well.
Yeah, I guess many will agree with the positive notion of friction as something creative. It's not something to be avoided. And I guess that leads to Byung-jun's central point that he makes. You sort of watched friction as physical thing, as well as social issue, and multiple dimensions of friction. Would you like to say a few words?
So friction, I believe that friction does have various aspects. So as an engineer who work with the hardware, as I mentioned earlier, I delved into the sound that are created from the contact between a paper and a pen. And that small friction is actually a process of creating a new data and new information. So the friction, in the sense, we can say that it's a starting point of a new creative process. And also friction, you see that if you look at the string of the violin and the bow of the violin, when these two come together and contact each other, it creates a beautiful sound and beautiful music. So we can see the constructive forces of friction with the violin and musical instrument. Friction can also lead to conflicts and burning energy. And today we are facing the issue of war, which is an extreme pattern of friction. So we are experiencing various types of frictions in our society. And so in our era, what we have to accept is that the fact that we are all sojourners, we are all foreigners. And the gist of the foreign being, is that everybody lives without their hometown. Of course, I know that everyone does have the hometown because they do have the place where they are born. However, oftentimes I think these hometowns are not real because they don't really have the places where they can have some strong sense of attachment. And in this sense, I think we all have to find out and discover our real, genuine hometown, our real family. We have to find our real, genuine family to have the strong sense of solidarity and belonging. This is the world that we are living in today. And in the sense, I think the love toward your hometown is very important, or strong attachment, because this hometown is something that you discover not inherently, but after your birth by yourself. And therefore, you have to have some ownership and make efforts so that these hometown can flourish. And when these efforts are played out, then you will have new family, new community where you yourself really belong to, and you will be able to have a lot of encounters from the community. So through my works, I have delved into this topic, and that's why the crossing or the friction that we are talking about, or the interactions beyond borders, and in the process, we can have some new discoveries. And I believe that this opens up the possibility of new balance and new coordination. And with that, thank you.
That's an exciting idea. Constant mobility brings about the new encounters, and this new encounter becomes vector of new communion. So that's very productive of new neighborhood. And I guess the neighborhood is generative of heat and conflict. This double potential is also open there. This brings to the presentation of Spang and Ray. You were very emphasizing the interface between human body and this machine and metal and sentient being, all the things. And I got the impression that you are shedding very positive light on that. What do you think? No, not necessarily. Go on.
I think when we first received the curatorial brief or for the panel discussion, one thing that really struck us was the idea of looking at friction from the point of view of efficiency and productivity. That is really looking at technology from a human-computer interface kind of perspective. But what we want to explore in our work is actually the idea of affordances and anti-affordances, and what constitute what constitute the kind of unknowing or sort of anti-interaction when you encounter a piece of work or when you come to encounter or interact with our work. So that's more than often we are trying to look at or subvert the assumed behavior that when you come to a mirror, you expect to see yourself, but in this case, you don't. And then what does it change in you? What are the different questions that brings about this change in behavior? And similarly, when we are going into producing Puritopia, what we want to look at is what the 3D world or the virtual world affords us. You know, if we assume that in the 3D world you can defy gravity, you can defy a lot of things, you can do things that is not a direct replica of the real world, but is it all true? Which is what we found out recently. You know, there has been some form of harassment happening in the metaverse. It's very disturbing, even though you're a 3D avatar. As a woman, you know, you feel very uncomfortable there. So there are natural behaviors that we do bring into this sort of digital twins that we conjure or that we create. So I think what we are often trying to explore here is actually the not the behavioral aspect of humans eventually it becoming, what do we mean by this landscape of behavior, this landscape of agency that we assume that it doesn't exist, but it does because of the pure manifestation of this like Marla was mentioning, entanglement of relationships, entanglement of behavior, be it in real life and be it on the virtual world. I think that is something really intrigues us, the both of us.
I want to go back to Nora, what she talks about the politics. And I'm getting less and less confident that we can separate the kind of politics. Like growing up, we used to have art mentors that tell us, on one side, art is politics. On the other side of the aisle, it's like, my art is purely aesthetic, it's form. And I think that message is getting very blurry for people who are straddling a lot of worlds, be it as your artist was saying, be it hometown or, outside, and be it real families or unreal families, and even now within the metaverse, and soon to be, the digital life that we will have, right? I mean, at least in Seoul, we have heard that the government is going to pour in money for a large metaverse for the citizens of Seoul, and everyone is quite excited about that, at least outside, right, in Singapore. So going back to Nora and this politics of entanglement, I do not see how we can extract and be kept clean of all the politics that are coming at us. It's just that we have, the reason why we are positive is because I think Spang LA is trying to be, we face a lot of negativity from slightly more traditional artists, saying that it's very encroaching. The role of digital and the role of tech is very encroaching into their spaces. And even in our community, we are very respectful of that, right? So whatever it is, I'm just saying that the messaging now, it's getting really, really blurred, and I do not see a way that it's getting clearer, but I enjoy the entanglement. And I'm sure Nora does as well. I'm just speaking for her at this point.
Nora, what's your response to this? The infinite dissolvement, the blurriness. Is that what you're saying, entanglement?
Yeah, I guess. But I also think that there's limits to it, there's a limit to kind of like what art can do in terms of political struggle. There's a limit in terms of like what politics can do in terms of art. And I think it's finding those limits and finding kind of where those things are and where kind of like real action can kind of unfold from. Is that I think is kind of like the purpose of kind of finding those kind of constraints and those different affordances, as you were saying as well. I mean, I think it's like in some ways I actually like like I'm quite positive about like political change, even though like the outlook isn't generally quite cast talk like quite bad in some places, like or maybe it's because it's like Irish politics is like very different to Central European politics. They have a very kind of like different take to like political change and political possibility. Because I remember like even like speaking to like the curatorial team who've been like embedded in like in living in Berlin for like, you know, the last like 10 years and sharing like my political positions with them, and then just looking at me going like, you're crazy, like there's no such thing as like political hope. And I was just like, no, but it can really like change like so much stuff. But I think that that was just like a reflection of kind of like my experience of like living in Ireland and just like being part of like quite a lot of like political change that had unfolded there, and especially in the last like 5 years there, it has really changed. Like young people have become extremely active. You know, they've been very involved in like political campaigns there along a lot of like lines, and this is not just like something new. This like connects to like larger like histories of like political struggle that have been like ongoing for like decades. So for example, like, you know, the marriage equality referendum that took place in like 2015, like that was like the result of like decades of campaigning since the 80s, you know. And similarly for like the female health rights as well, the referendum that just recently passed as well. Again, like decades and decades of campaigning and two failed referendums, the consequence of like two failed referendums in Irish politics. And, you know, it's for me, it's like, I think it's just like timing and, you know, also just, yeah, I don't know, many things, I guess, but timing and having some type of kind of like political hope where you can finally see some kind of like outcomes of the limitations of like overcoming that refusal.
Tan, looks like this brings back us to the question of your own festival, the way it's perceived and conceived of and organized. It's really an embodiment of a big convergence, crisscrossing and here and there. Do you think it's always a positive thing, or it's already a reality that we have to live with, or is there any risk involved that we have to be aware of?
Well, I mean, while we were talking, I was checking myself with the Dutch mentality, which is always very much about consensus. We are trained from the early years on finding consensus, and but I think the Netherlands changed radically like 20 years ago when the first right-wing populist politician was murdered. And it was impossible to keep our innocence and to keep our consensus thought, like everyone will find a way of collaborating, like on a political level, but also like on a personal level. And I think we in the Netherlands are still struggling with how to deal with friction, because we are always like ironing out the friction, and that's impossible. I mean, the right-wing parties in Holland are, you know, like really pushing everyone and everything, and they use conflict, they use friction to make their point, or maybe to disturb the entire system, or disturb the people. I'm not even sure what their main reason is to do it, but it's funny, like, no, not funny, it's not the right word, but like in Ireland, I think, yeah, I mean, you grow up with friction, with poles, but we grow up with, you know, like everything, everyone should be taking care of each other, and we all like a happy family, and that is not possible anymore. So we are trying to find a way to deal with friction and to deal with conflict. That's not in our DNA.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. Byung-jun, you might have something to add on, because you already talked about regrouping of community, family, home. Those very quote-unquote antiquated notion can be reinvented. That's what your point. I mean, you're seeing this friction as a potential seed to open up a new communion. What do you think? I mean, is that really serious thinking that's reflected in your artworks?
So yes, I deal with the interactions between people and in my artwork. So you may think that I'm a very well-rounded person and I do have a lot of friends, but actually the opposite is true. So I actually almost gave up on my interpersonal relationship. So that's why I started mingling with robots and getting along with robots. That's why I created Robot, because for me, having an interaction with human being, fellow human, is too difficult. I work with the other artists and I did some performance, but oftentimes I quarrel, I fought, and things were so hard. So that's why I decided to work with robots. So I created robots and I tried to mingle with them, live with them. And I thought about the rights of robots. They should have some right. And so when I think about the community, family, friends, or let's say that the communication with between people, basically I believe that there are a very big barrier that I cannot address on my own. So I do have the vision, I have my own ideals, and as an artist, I try to communicate that and present the possibility. So I make some efforts for that, but I also do have some doubts whether it's really possible. Can we really overcome the gigantic barrier and recover and restore our relationship? Can we really go back to what we used to be in the past? In the sense, I actually have a lot of suspicions and doubt. But I now come to realize that I even have to accept that suspicion as well. So I cannot be family with Robert. Robert cannot be my family member, but in my heart, for objects or technologies, or like any non-human being, I believe that they can also be my friends or more than my family members. Which means that we are living in a very fragmented world where everybody is very lonely, and that's all.
I guess everyone's addressing this grand new reality that we are faced with, in which things are enmeshed, things are all interconnected, interdependent. And this grand age of convergence, or whatever you call it, is something we cannot escape from. So if we have to live with it, I think there's something we need. It's obviously creative intervention. And prior to this creative intervention and any initiative, what we need probably is courage. Courage to experiment. Courage to accept and live with this friction. And that might be yet another departure. All right, our time's almost up, right? We can close up or open up our conversation to floor or online community. Is there any question you have prepared? Any question from or comments from floor? Okay, what's YouTube question? It says, wait a second. Well, in the meantime, do you have some concluding remarks that you'd like to underscore, you folks, while we are waiting for the online question? Come
I was just
on.
going to say that like what you said there about like courage was actually kind of like really great, about like how this is really an important like aspect of like what we need for kind of defining and redefining our relationship to one another, our relationship to like the environment, to the planet. And I think this is a really important like quality that like we can kind of like engage with in order to kind of like make changes, make adjustments, and to counteract any types of kind of fear against like, you know, tension, political indifference, apathy, or even like things such as like fear and disinformation.
Right, those things come under the guise of politeness sometimes, don't they? Right? I hate PC. That is quieting and that is deadening and everything. No? What do you think?
I think that there's some things that maybe are like rightfully should be respected, and other things, yeah, we shouldn't be afraid. We should be afraid to like make mistakes or have failure as well. So.
Sure. Other presenters, final remarks?
Well, I think that we all should make sure that we think of new scenarios, because I think the right-wing movement, which is like really huge everywhere in the world, is kind of based on nostalgia, on a time that things were better. I mean, the facts are not true at all, but it's the feeling of being safe and being better. So I understand the fear of the future. That was one of the themes that we still have in our books. Like there's a huge fear of the future. And so that's why people, tend to go back into the past and tend to vote for this right-wing parties, because they promise you a world that never existed. And so I think it's our duty, maybe a big word for the artists and for festivals, to make sure there's new scenarios that people can move forward instead of going back. And there's no option to go back.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, politicians are creators of horror, and horror is the fuel for our, for horror is a driving force of intimidation, and that leads to the very apocalyptic imagination, really. So, a wonderful point. Okay, Spang and Ray.
Sorry, because of the limitations of the size, we have to switch between, like that. Well, thanks for using the word courage and addressing Ton directly. I guess Singapore is in a slightly reversal position. People in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, have had a long history of, quite monolithic cultures and all that. And so they've gone through that historical march. Singapore is a very young nation, and we are actually, and the government that we have is very centrist and, a little bit to the right. And actually, it's the young people now, obviously, that won the slightly centrist left. And I see people complain a lot, right, about the millennials, the Gen Z. I hear my parents complaining a lot about them, the older relatives. I actually am in between, but I'm actually hopeful because I see the younger artists, the younger people, not just artists, in general, students, being more vocal as to what they want from society, as to the kind of art they are willing to engage in and not willing to engage in. So that in of itself, it's like, for me, I feel like me and Lei, we feel like we were, it's like they missed us. We were kind of caught in between these stasis. But Lei would say that she loves the students, and she's always so hopeful about what they can contribute later, which is why Spang and Lei, in terms of Puritopia and all the kind of work that we do, we to the youth. We are very youth-based, actually. So yeah, that's it. Bravery and courageous.
Right. I guess we have room for reinterpreting the receding or withdrawal or retreat as yet another search for utopic vision too. So in that regards, we have to probably give ourselves some room to understand, make sense of the new sentiment and sensibility of rising generations as well. Okay. Ray, and after that, finally, Kwan, Byungjun.
I think what Ton just shared resonated with me a lot. Whereby maybe in Netherlands there's a kind of like a sentiment towards nostalgia. That the past is something that is safe and warm and comfortable, and the future seems something threatening. But over here, what we are witnessing in Singapore is, I would say it's split in such a way that there's a certain degree that maybe the community here or the general citizen at large, maybe the elder generation would prefer to go back to the nostalgic kind of past, but you do see the kind of forward-looking future, I would say the future hopeful of the future kind of approaches, which manifest in not just I would say sort of the conversations that we are witnessing here in Singapore, but also what the younger generation or what they're hoping for. You do see more sort of science fiction literature, speculative literature surrounding Singapore. We are a very young country, and there's always this constant fear of whether or not we will be around in 100 years' time as a country. So that in and of itself is both ironically something hopeful, that you want to imagine it existing in 100 years' time, yet at the same time it is bundled with a lot of fear, like what if we are not around in 100 years' time. So when it comes to speculative fiction or speculative narratives surrounding the future of Singapore, I would say it's like it's a paradox in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, division itself is not really detrimental to our society as such. It's contingent on how it's produced and reiterated. I think so. The same notion. The self-generated terror towards the the doomsday can be controlled, and in a way, it could be worked out to generate a positive energy towards it. So, yeah, the openness. Byungjun, since we're out of time.
Because of the time constraint, I'll be very brief. So all the conflict and the disputes that we are experiencing, all the frictions, I believe that I will not say that we can overcome that, because it may not be possible, but someone talked about the courage and in order to address the challenges and crisis, yes, we can make some effort and we can work. And one of the things that we can work on is to have sympathy and communication. So we all know that, but somehow I think we have given up on many of these things. So little by little, I think we have to work hard to come closer to this sense of sympathy
and
empathy.
It's an amazing word to conclude our session. Thank you very much for your participation and incredible presentation and conversation. All right. Okay, I'll see you around next time, next chance. Ciao.